Hey everyone, and welcome back to the deepest part of the night. Make sure you're comfortable and fully settled in for a long one. Tonight, we're blending the soothing sound of the rain with unsettling and chilling stories, so you can truly let go and relax. If this mix of calm and unease feels like your kind of escape, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss more long, rainy nights of narrative dread. Also, let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is right now. Now, let the rain surround you, and allow the stories to pull you into the night. Story 1. I've always been the kind of guy who prefers the company of trees to people. I live out near the edge of the Mark Twain National Forest in Missouri, and for as long as I can remember, spending time in the deep woods has been my reset button. I'm not talking about the well-maintained trails with the little gravel parking lots and the maps posted at the trailhead. I'm talking about the deep timber, the places where the canopy is so thick that the GPS on your phone stops working and the only sound is the wind moving through the valleys. I've been hiking these hills for 15 years. I know the terrain. I know the wildlife. I know that if you respect the woods, generally speaking, they leave you alone. But what happened last November changed the way I look at the forest. It changed the way I look at everything. It was a Tuesday, late afternoon. I had taken the day off work just to clear my head. I parked my truck off an old fire service road and hiked about 4 miles in, aiming for a limestone ridge I like to sit on. I wasn't hunting, just walking. I had my pack, some water, a flashlight, and a knife on my belt, standard gear. I decided to take a shortcut through a dry creek bed that wound through the bottom of a hollow. It was rough walking, lots of loose shale and fallen slick logs, but it cut about a mile off the loop. I was watching my footing, head down, listening to the crunch of my boots on the rocks. Then, something caught the corner of my eye. A flash. It was the kind of sharp, piercing glint you get when sunlight hits glass or polished metal. It stopped me dead in my tracks because there shouldn't be anything shiny out here. This was miles from the nearest house. I looked up. About 50 yards ahead, right in the center of the dry creek bed, something was standing upright. At first, my brain couldn't process it. I thought maybe it was a piece of illegal dumping. People toss refrigerators and old doors into ravines all the time. But as I got closer, the shape resolved itself. It was a mirror. Not a shard of glass, not a small hand mirror. This was a massive, full-length antique vanity mirror. It had a heavy, dark oak frame with intricate carvings of vines and leaves along the edges. It looked like something you'd find in a Victorian bedroom, not standing perfectly vertical in the mud and rocks of a Missouri hollow. It wasn't leaned against a tree. It wasn't propped up by rocks. It was just standing, as if the frame was rooted into the stones. I stopped about 10 feet away. The air in the hollow suddenly felt heavy, like the pressure drop before a tornado. The birds, which had been noisy just a few minutes ago, were dead silent. The weirdest part was the condition of the glass. It had rained 2 days ago. The woods were damp, muddy, and dirty. But the glass surface was immaculate. Not a streak of mud, not a speck of dust, not a single water spot. It was polished to a shine so perfect it looked liquid. I walked a slow circle around it. There were no footprints. The mud around the base of the mirror was smooth and undisturbed. No drag marks to show how someone hauled a 100-pound piece of furniture out here. It was like it had just dropped from the sky. I should have turned around. Every instinct I had as an outdoorsman was screaming at me that this was wrong. It felt like a trap. But curiosity is a dangerous thing. I stepped in front of it. I looked at my reflection. There I was, olive drab jacket, blue jeans, gray beanie cap. I looked tired. The reflection showed the trees behind me, the gray sky, the steep banks of the creek. I leaned in closer to check the glass. And that's when I noticed the first thing. The reflection was breathing at a different rhythm than I was. I could see the rise and fall of my chest in the glass. I held my breath to test it. In the mirror, my chest kept moving, up and down, slow and steady. I let out a sharp exhale, creating a little puff of fog in the cold air. The reflection did not exhale. There was no fog. A cold shiver violently ran down my spine, starting at my neck and ending in my boots. I took a step to the left. The reflection followed, but it was late. It wasn't a huge delay, maybe half a second. Just enough to be noticeable. Just enough to make my stomach turn over. It was like watching a video with bad audio sync. I moved, and then, a beat later, the reflection moved. I stepped right. Pause. The reflection stepped right. I raised my hand. Pause. The reflection raised its hand. Okay, I whispered out loud. That's enough. My voice sounded dead in the hollow, absorbed instantly by the trees. I turned to leave. I physically turned my body away from the mirror to walk back the way I came. But as I turned, I caught a glimpse of the glass. The reflection hadn't turned. I froze. My back was to the mirror, but I looked over my shoulder. In the glass, I was still facing forward. The reflection me was standing still, arms at its sides, staring directly into my eyes. I wasn't looking at my back. I was looking at my front. I turned back around slowly to face it. My heart was hammering against my ribs so hard I thought it might crack a bone. The thing in the mirror was watching me. And now that I looked closer, I realized the background was wrong. In the real world, it was late afternoon, gray, overcast, flat light. In the mirror, the woods behind my reflection were dark. It was nighttime in the glass. I could see the moon reflecting off the wet leaves behind the figure. The figure, the thing that looked like me, tilted its head. I hadn't moved. Its face began to change. It was subtle at first. The eyes widened just a fraction too much. The skin seemed to pull tight against the cheekbones. It looked like a mask that was slipping. It wasn't scared. It wasn't confused. It looked hungry. It looked like a predator that had just waited a very long time for something to step into its trap. I took a step backward. The reflection didn't move. It stayed pressed against the glass from the inside. And then, it smiled. I don't smile like that. No human smiles like that. The corners of its mouth went up too high, stretching the skin until I thought it would tear. It revealed teeth that were too straight, too white, and too sharp. It raised its hand. Not to wave. It pointed. It raised a finger and pointed directly over my shoulder, behind me. I heard the sound of a twig snapping. It came from right behind me. Close. Maybe 5 feet away. I didn't think. I didn't look. The panic took over completely. I spun around and sprinted. I scrambled up the steep bank of the creek bed, slipping on the wet leaves, grabbing onto roots and thorny vines to pull myself up. I didn't care about the noise I was making. I didn't care about the gear I was dropping. I ran until my lungs burned. I ran until the trees started to blur together. I kept waiting to feel a hand grab my ankle or hear footsteps right behind me. When I finally hit the service road, I fell to my knees, gasping for air. I pulled my sidearm from my belt and aimed it back at the tree line, shaking uncontrollably. Nothing came out of the woods. Just the wind and the falling leaves. I stayed there for 10 minutes, listening. Once my heart rate dropped below a sprint, I realized I had left my favorite hiking stick back there. I didn't care. I walked the 4 miles back to my truck, looking over my shoulder every 10 steps. When I got inside the cab and locked the doors, I finally felt safe enough to breathe. I didn't tell anyone. Who would I tell? The sheriff? Hey, I saw a haunted mirror in the creek? They'd lock me up for a psych eval. But here is the part that keeps me awake at night. 2 weeks later, I went back. I had to know. I had convinced myself I was hallucinating. Maybe it was a gas leak from a swamp pocket. Maybe I was dehydrated. I brought a buddy with me this time. Didn't tell him why, just said I lost some gear. We hiked to the hollow. I found the dry creek bed. I found the spot. The mirror was gone. There were no tracks. There was no sign of the heavy oak frame being dragged away. But the mud where it had stood, it was scorched. There was a perfect rectangle of blackened, burned earth right in the center of the creek bed. It looked like someone had taken a blowtorch to the ground in the shape of that mirror. And in the center of the burn mark lay my hiking stick. It was snapped clean in half. I don't hike alone anymore. I don't go off trail. And I removed every mirror from my bedroom. Because sometimes, late at night, when I catch my reflection in the bathroom window, I swear I see it blink when I don't. Story 2. I've been hiking the Appalachian Trail in sections for the last 5 years. I've seen some weird things out there. Abandoned cars, creepy dolls nailed to trees, even a bathtub full of rainwater in the middle of nowhere. But nothing prepared me for the stairs. It was late October, and I was hiking a less popular route near the border of Virginia and West Virginia. The leaves were turning, painting the mountains in rust and gold. I decided to go off-trail to find a water source marked on my old topo map. I was pushing through a dense thicket of rhododendrons when the forest suddenly opened up into a small, circular clearing. And there it was. A staircase. But not like the ones you hear about in creepy stories, rotting wood or rusty metal. This was magnificent. It was a wide, sweeping staircase made of polished white marble. It had ornate, wrought iron railings painted black, twisted into shapes that looked like vines or snakes. It rose about 15 feet into the air and ended abruptly in open space. There was no foundation, no ruins of a house, just pristine marble steps rising out of the dirt and dead leaves. It looked like it had been cut out of a mansion and dropped here by a giant hand. I walked around it. The marble was cold and smooth to the touch. It was spotless. No moss, no lichen, no bird droppings. In the middle of a damp forest, it was impossibly clean. I should have walked away. That deep, primal part of my brain, the lizard brain, was telling me that this was wrong, predatory. But it was just so beautiful. I put my boot on the first step. The moment my weight settled on the marble, the forest went silent. It wasn't a gradual quiet. It was like someone had flipped a switch. The wind died. The birds stopped singing. Even the sound of the creek I was looking for vanished. The air pressure dropped, popping my ears. I took another step. A smell hit me. It was faint at first, then overpowering. It smelled like expensive, heavy perfume, roses and musk, layered over something else. Something sweet and cloying, like rotting flowers. Or rotting meat. I kept climbing. I don't know why. It felt like I was being pulled. I reached the middle of the staircase. I was about 7 feet off the ground. I looked down at the forest floor, expecting to see my pack where I left it. But the forest floor looked different. The leaves weren't brown anymore. They were gray. The trees looked sharper, more jagged. The light had a greenish tint to it. And then I heard it. From the top of the stairs, where there was absolutely nothing but air, I heard the distinct sound of a heavy door unlatching. Click-thunk. Then the creak of hinges. And then footsteps. Clack. 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 It sounded like hard-soled shoes, maybe dress shoes or heels, walking on marble. They were coming down the stairs towards me. I looked up. There was nothing there. Just empty air and the tree canopy. But the sound was getting louder. Closer. Heavy impacts on the stone. Clack. Clack. The smell of rot got stronger, making me gag. Panic finally broke through the trance. I turned and practically jumped down the remaining steps. I landed hard on the dirt, rolling to break my fall. As soon as I hit the ground, the sound of the forest rushed back in. The wind roared. A crow cawed directly overhead. I scrambled to my feet and looked back at the stairs. They were silent. Empty. I grabbed my phone. I needed proof. My hands were shaking so bad I almost dropped it, but I managed to snap 3 pictures. Then I grabbed my pack and ran. I didn't stop until I was back on the main trail, miles away. When I got back to my car that evening, I sat in the parking lot and pulled up the photos. The first 2 were blurry, just white marble against the trees. But the third one made my blood run cold. It was taken from the bottom, looking up. The stairs were empty. But on the black iron railing, near the very top, there was something. A hand? It was pale, almost translucent, with long, spindly fingers. It was gripping the rail tight, like someone bracing themselves. And on the ring finger, there was a dark band that looked like a tarnished wedding ring. I went back 2 weeks later with a ranger friend of mine. I had to know. I had the GPS coordinates from the photo metadata. We hiked straight to the spot. We found the clearing. We found the rhododendrons. But there were no stairs. In the center of the clearing, where the marble base had been, there was a depression in the earth. A rectangular pit, about 6 feet deep, filled with black, stagnant water. It smelled like roses and rot. We left. We didn't talk about it on the hike back. I deleted the photos. I don't hike off trail anymore. And every time I hear hard shoes walking on a stone floor, I flinch. Story 3. I'm a sales rep, which means I spend half my life behind the wheel of a company car. I know the highways of the Pacific Northwest better than I know my own backyard. I've driven through blizzards, fog banks, and forest fires without batting an eye. But what happened on Highway 101 last November made me trade in my territory for a desk job. It was a Tuesday night, around 11 p.m. I was driving south along the coast, trying to make it to Eureka before the motels closed. A storm had rolled in off the ocean, one of those heavy, relentless downpours that turns the world into a gray blur. The wind was shaking my sedan, and visibility was maybe 20 feet. I was the only car on the road. Just me, the headlights, and the rain. I came around a bend near a stretch of dense redwood forest. My headlights swept across the shoulder, and I saw her. A figure standing right on the edge of the asphalt. She wasn't hitchhiking. She wasn't walking. She was just standing there, facing the trees, her back to the road. She was wearing a bright yellow raincoat, the heavy, rubber kind fishermen use, but no hood. Her hair was dark, plastered to her head, soaking wet. My first instinct was to stop. It was freezing out there. She looked stranded. I started to brake, slowing from 50 down to a crawl. I rolled down the passenger window a crack. "Hey!" I yelled over the roar of the rain. "Do you need a ride? Are you okay?" She didn't move. She didn't turn. She just stood there, rigid as a statue. Something about her stillness set off alarm bells in my head. A human being in that kind of weather would be huddled, shivering, looking for shelter. She looked like she didn't even feel the cold. I took my foot off the brake, ready to speed up. "Miss?" Then she turned. She didn't turn her body. She just rotated her neck. Slowly, mechanically, until she was looking back over her shoulder at me. Her face was wrong. It was too smooth. Like a mannequin or a doll. Her eyes were wide open, unblinking, despite the rain driving into them. They were pale blue, almost white in the headlight beams. She opened her mouth. I expected a scream, or a plea for help. Instead, she spoke. Her voice didn't sound like it was coming from outside. It sounded like it was coming from inside the car, right next to my ear. Clear. Dry. Whisper quiet. "Bobby." I slammed on the brakes so hard the car skidded sideways. My heart stopped. Nobody calls me Bobby. Not my wife. Not my friends. Not my boss. Only my grandmother called me Bobby. And she died 15 years ago. "Bobby," the voice whispered again. "Don't go home." I didn't wait for a third sentence. I floored it. The tires spun on the wet pavement, caught traction, and I shot forward. I watched the rearview mirror. She was gone. No figure in yellow. Just empty road. I drove 80 miles an hour for the next 20 minutes, white-knuckled. I tried to turn on the radio to drown out the sound of the rain. I hit the power button. Static. Then, through the static, a song started playing. It was an old song. "You Are My Sunshine." My grandmother used to hum it while she cooked. The singing wasn't coming from a station. The display on the dashboard said, AUX input. But there was nothing plugged into the AUX. The voice singing was scratchy, old, and familiar. "You'll never know, dear, how much I love you." Then it cut to a dial tone. A loud, piercing screech that made me rip the radio fuse out of the panel just to make it stop. I didn't go home that night. I stayed in a brightly lit truck stop until dawn. When I finally called my wife the next morning, she was crying. "Where were you?" she sobbed. "I've been calling all night. There was a landslide on the highway just south of Eureka. 3 cars were crushed. If you had kept driving..." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. I don't know what stood on the side of the road that night. I don't know if it was a ghost, a demon, or something else. But I know it saved my life. And I know it had my grandmother's voice. Story 4. I've camped in the Rockies, the Appalachians, and pretty much everywhere in between. I know what a bear looks like. I know how they move, how they sound, and what their tracks look like in the mud. So let me be clear, what I saw in the Bitterroot Mountains last September was not a bear. I was 3 days into a solo trip, deep in the wilderness area near the Idaho-Montana border. It's rugged country, steep canyons, dense pine forests, and not a lot of people. I hadn't seen another hiker since I left the trailhead. I set up camp near a small, nameless creek. The ground was soft sand, perfect for sleeping. I ate dinner, hung my bear bag, and crashed early. The night was uneventful. No weird noises, no snapping twigs. Just the water running over stones. I woke up at sunrise. It was cold, frost coating my tent fly. I crawled up to make coffee. That's when I saw them. Tracks. In the sand, circling my tent. They were fresh. The edges were sharp, not crumbled by wind or dew. And they were huge. My boot is a size 12. These tracks were easily 18 inches long. But they were narrow. Unnaturally narrow. A bear track is wide, like a pad. These looked like a human foot that had been stretched out like taffy. And the toes, there were 4 of them. Long, finger-like toes that dug deep into the sand. They circled the tent twice. Then they stopped right at the zipper door. There were 2 prints side by side, facing the tent, as if whatever made them had stood there and watched me sleep. I felt a cold sweat break out on my back. I grabbed my bear spray and scanned the tree line. Nothing. Just pines and shadows. I told myself it was a prank. Maybe another hiker messing with me. Or maybe a deformed elk? I tried to rationalize it. I packed up camp in record time. I wanted to put miles between me and those tracks. I hiked about 5 miles upriver. By noon, the sun was high, and I started to feel silly. It was a beautiful day. I stopped at a bend in the creek to filter water. I was crouched by the bank, pumping water into my bottle. The creek was clear as glass. I watched the water striders dancing on the surface. Then I saw the reflection. In the water, reflected from the opposite bank, was a shape. It was standing behind a cluster of willows. It was tall, maybe 8 feet. It was covered in something that looked like matted gray fur or moss. I froze. I didn't look up. I kept staring at the reflection, my heart hammering against my ribs. The figure shifted. It moved with a jerky, unnatural motion, like a stop-motion puppet. It leaned out from the willows. I saw its face in the water. It didn't have a snout like a bear. It had a flat face. Wide-set eyes that looked too big for its skull. And a mouth that was just a slit. It was watching me. Just like the track suggested. It had followed me 5 miles. I slowly stood up, keeping my hand on the bear spray. I looked across the creek. The willows were still swaying slightly, but the figure was gone. Vanished. I didn't wait to see if it would come back. I left my water filter. I left my favorite Nalgene bottle. I turned and power hiked back to the trail, not stopping until I hit the fire road. I showed the photos of the tracks to a fish and game officer back in town. He looked at them, frowned, and zoomed in on the 4 toes. "Must be a double register," he said. "Bear stepping in its own track. Distorts the shape. Bears don't have skinny feet," I argued. He handed my phone back. It's a bear, son. Or a wolf with a limp. Don't let your imagination run wild. But as I walked away, I heard him call another ranger over. Check Sector 4. He whispered. Another one. I don't go into the deep woods anymore. And if I wake up and see tracks around my tent, I don't stop to take pictures. I run. Story 5. I've always considered myself a rational person. I don't believe in ghosts, I don't follow urban legends, and I'm the first person to call out paranormal videos as fake. When you spend enough time in the backcountry, you learn that every weird sound has an explanation, a shifting log, a thermal inversion, or a hungry coyote. But what happened to me last April in the Black Hills of South Dakota forced me to accept a reality that shouldn't exist. It wasn't about a monster in the bushes. It was about the terrifying realization that I might not be the only me in these woods. The Black Hills are ancient. There's a specific energy there, a heavy, quiet density to the air that makes you feel like an intruder. I was on a solo trek through a remote section of the Norbeck Wilderness, about 15 miles from any paved road. The ground was saturated from the spring thaw, creating a landscape of gray granite and slick, black mud. It was the kind of terrain where every step leaves a perfect, unmistakable record of your presence. I set up my camp late in the afternoon on a high ridge overlooking a valley of ponderosa pines. I was tired, my legs were aching, and the damp cold was starting to bite through my layers. I pitched my tent, a bright orange solo ultralight, and did my usual routine. I checked the perimeter, cooked a quick meal on my stove, and changed into my dry sleeping socks. Before crawling into my sleeping bag, I decided to set up my GoPro on a small tripod outside. I'm a bit of a hobbyist photographer, and I wanted to capture a time-lapse of the stars moving over the ridge. I set it to take a frame every 30 seconds, positioned it about 10 feet from my tent facing the valley, and zipped myself in for the night. I'm a heavy sleeper. Usually, once I'm out, nothing short of a thunderstorm wakes me up. I didn't hear a thing all night. No footsteps, no zippers, no whispers. I woke up at 6:30 a.m. to the sound of a distant woodpecker and the pale, gray light of a foggy mountain morning. The first thing I noticed when I stepped out of the tent was the mud. It was everywhere, and it was covered in footprints. My heart didn't sink immediately. My first thought was actually annoyance. Great, some other hiker wandered into my camp while I was asleep, I muttered. But as I looked closer at the tracks, the annoyance turned into a cold, paralyzing dread. The boots that made those tracks were identical to mine. I'm talking about a very specific pair of custom-fitted Salwa mountain boots. I had replaced the stock laces with bright neon green paracord, and the left heel had a distinct, deep gouge where I'd stepped on a sharp piece of obsidian a year ago. Every single footprint around my tent had that gouge. Every single one had the same tread pattern. But it got worse. The tracks didn't just circle the tent. They came out of the tree line, walked 3 laps around my sleeping area, and this is where my brain started to reject the information, they led directly to the door of my tent. The zipper was closed. It had been closed all night. I remember double-checking it. Yet the tracks led right into the nylon wall. There were no exit tracks. It looked like I had stood outside in the mud, walked into my own tent without opening it, and disappeared. I checked my phone's health app 0 steps between 10 p.m. and 6:30 a.m. My phone had been in my pocket the whole time. If I had been sleepwalking, it would have logged the movement. With shaking hands, I went over to the GoPro. The lens was fogged with condensation, but the battery was still alive. I pulled the SD card, put it into my tablet, and started scrubbing through the footage. The first 3 hours were just what I expected. The sky cleared, the stars moved in a beautiful arc, and the silhouette of the pines stayed motionless. Around 2:14 a.m., the fog started rolling in. At 3:02 a.m., the me on the screen appeared. I watched myself walk out of the dark tree line. I was wearing my flannel shirt, my hiking pants, and my Salwa boots. I looked wrong. My movement was too smooth, too fluid. I didn't have the slight limp I usually have in my left knee. The me on the screen walked up to the camera. It leaned down, its face filling the frame. I was staring at my own eyes, but they were devoid of any light. There was no blink, no breath fogging the lens. The other me just stared for a full minute, then turned around and started walking toward the tent. I watched as the figure reached the tent. It didn't reach for the zipper. It just leaned forward. Its body didn't collide with the fabric. It seemed to merge with it. It leaned further and further until its entire torso was inside, and then its legs simply slid into the nylon like it was walking through water. The tent didn't even ripple. I was sitting there in the dirt, watching this on my tablet, and I felt a sudden, sharp pressure in my rucksack. I hadn't opened it yet this morning. I reached back, my fingers trembling, and unzipped the top brain pocket of the pack. Lying right on top of my map was a piece of paper. It was a leaf torn from my own Write in the Rain notebook. On it, in my own unmistakable handwriting, the way I looped my G's and crossed my T's, was a single sentence. "Do not look back when you leave, or I'll have to come back out." I didn't pack my tent. I didn't even grab my stove. I shoved my tablet and my boots into my pack, put on my spare camp shoes, and I ran. I didn't care about the mud. I didn't care about the miles. I followed my own trail back to the trailhead, my eyes fixed firmly on the ground in front of me. I felt the weight of a gaze on the back of my neck the entire time. I felt the air behind me ripple, like someone was walking just 2 inches from my heels. I made it to my car in 4 hours. I drove until I hit the interstate, then I drove another 6 hours before I dared to look in the rearview mirror. When I got home, I burned the boots. I deleted the footage. But a week later, I found a small clump of black, mountain mud on my bedroom floor, right next to my bed. And sitting on top of the mud was a single neon green paracord lace, tied into a perfect hangman's noose. I don't go to the Black Hills anymore. I don't go camping at all. Because I realized that the me who came out of those woods might not be the same one who went in. And I'm terrified that one night, I'll wake up and see myself standing at the foot of the bed, waiting for my turn to go back into the mud. Story 6. The Shenandoah Valley is famous for its wildlife. If you drive Skyline Drive at dusk, you'll see dozens, maybe hundreds of white-tailed deer grazing peacefully in the meadows. They're a symbol of the park, gentle, skittish, and predictable. I've spent years photographing them. I know their gait, the way they flick their ears when they're nervous, and the specific way their eyes reflect light in the dark. But what I saw last November, near a remote ridge overlooking the Blue Ridge Mountains, has made it impossible for me to look at a deer the same way again. It wasn't a predator, and it wasn't a ghost. It was a glitch in the very design of life. I was out on a solo photography trek, hoping to catch the blue hour light over the valley. I'd hiked deep into a section of the park that's mostly abandoned orchards and steep, rocky inclines. The air was bone-chillingly cold, and the silence was heavy with the scent of dry pine and incoming snow. I was positioned on a narrow ledge, my tripod set up, waiting for the sun to drop low enough to turn the horizon that perfect shade of deep indigo. About 40 yards below my position, in a small clearing choked with dead brambles, a buck stepped out from the tree line. At first glance, he was a beauty. A massive 10-pointer, thick-necked and powerful. But as I tracked him through my 600mm telephoto lens, my finger froze on the shutter button. Something about the way he was moving made my stomach do a slow, sick turn. Deer move with a certain fluid grace. This thing moved like a marionette being controlled by someone who had never seen a four-legged animal before. Each step was a series of jerky, mechanical twitches. Its legs didn't seem to have the right number of joints. When it stepped forward, its front left knee didn't just bend, it snapped backward, then rotated 360 degrees before hitting the ground. I leaned into my viewfinder, adjusting the focus. That's when I saw the neck. A white-tailed deer's neck is muscular and proportional. This creature's neck was easily 3 feet long, thin as a sapling, and it was undulating, sliding beneath the skin like a snake trying to find an exit. It didn't turn its head to look around. The neck simply elongated and coiled, allowing the head to peer over its own shoulder, while the body remained facing forward. My heart was hammering so hard I could hear it in my ears. I knew I should leave, but I was mesmerized by the sheer impossibility of what I was seeing. I decided to take a single shot. The shutter click on my Nikon is quiet, but in that dead silent valley, it sounded like a gunshot. The bug stopped. It didn't bolt. It didn't even flinch. Slowly, with that same agonizing, snapping motion of its joints, it turned its body toward me. But it didn't stay on the flat ground of the clearing. It walked over to a near vertical limestone cliff face, a wall of rock that no hoofed animal could possibly scale, and it simply stepped onto it. It ignored gravity. It walked up that vertical wall like it was a flat meadow, its hooves making a wet, suction-like sound against the stone. It stopped when it was level with my ledge, about 30 feet away, standing at a perfect 90-degree angle to the earth. We locked eyes. A deer's eyes are on the sides of its head. They have a wide field of vision but can't focus forward like a human's. This thing's eyes had migrated. They were sitting right in the front of its skull, sunken deep into the sockets. And they weren't brown. They were a milky, translucent white, with pupils that were vertical slits, like a cat's, but they were vibrating, pulsing in and out with a rapid, frantic rhythm. Then, it opened its mouth. It didn't bleat or snort. It unhinged its lower jaw until the skin of its face stretched thin enough to see the bone beneath. A sound started to emerge from its throat. It was high-pitched, distorted, and metallic. It sounded like a recording of a woman screaming, but it was being played backward at double speed, layered over the sound of grinding glass. As it made the sound, the creature began to fold. That's the only way I can describe it. Its ribs started to collapse inward. Its long neck retracted into its chest with a wet, crunching sound, and its legs tucked up under its belly until it looked like a grotesque, fleshy ball of fur and bone. I didn't stay to see what happened next. I grabbed my camera, leaving the tripod behind, and I scrambled back up the ridge. I didn't care about the darkness or the ice. I ran until I hit Skyline Drive, and I didn't stop until I was locked inside my car with the heater on full blast. The next morning, I compelled myself to look at the photos. I needed proof that I hadn't just suffered a mountain-induced hallucination. I opened the file from the ledge. The photo was clear. It showed the buck standing on the vertical cliff. But in the high-resolution crop, I saw something that made me drop my laptop. The fur on the deer wasn't hair. If you looked closely at the edges, you could see that the entire body was covered in millions of tiny, pale human fingers. They were microscopic, but they were all reaching out, grasping at the air, woven together to look like a coat of brown fur. I went back to that ridge a week later with a park ranger, claiming I'd lost my tripod and got lost. We found the spot. My tripod was still there, but it had been twisted into a literal knot, the aluminum tubing braided like rope. On the ground where the creature had stood, I found a pair of discarded antlers. I picked them up, thinking they were a standard shed. But when my skin touched the bone, I felt a jolt of ice-cold repulsion. They weren't made of antler velvet or calcium. The texture was wrong. It felt like polished ivory, but when I held them up to the light, I could see the distinct, porous grain of human femurs. They had been carved and fused together to look like a 10-point rack. I left them there. I haven't been back to Shenandoah since. I sold my camera gear and took up woodshop, something where the only things I have to look at are dead, predictable planks of oak. People ask me why I don't go out for the blue hour anymore. I just tell them the light isn't the same as it used to be. But the truth is, I'm afraid of what I might see through a lens. I'm afraid that if I look too closely at the world will start folding itself to look back at me. And I know that somewhere out there, there's a buck with 100 joints and 1,000,000 fingers, still standing on a vertical wall, waiting for someone to click the shutter. Story 7. Sometimes I think silence isn't just the absence of noise. In certain places, silence is a living, breathing thing that waits for you to speak first just so it can steal your voice. I've been an urban explorer and backcountry trekker in the Sierra Nevadas for over a decade now. I've seen it all, from the ghost towns, of the 1849 gold rush to decommission Cold War bunkers with rusted blast doors swallowed by manzanita. But what happened last July at the Hope Mine changed everything I thought I knew about physics, reality, and my own sanity. The story didn't start in the mountains. It started in a dusty basement archive in Placer County. I spent 3 weeks there, hunched over topographical maps from the 1930s and 40s, trying to locate a portal that officially ceased to exist in 1944. According to the old ledgers, the Hope Mine wasn't shuttered because the gold ran out. It was closed for unforeseen geological anomalies. The reports mentioned strange acoustic phenomena that made the miners refuse to descend into the lower drifts. They claimed they could hear the sounds of their own deaths, screams, falling rocks, snapping timbers, days before any actual cave-in occurred. I finally pinned down the coordinates. They led to a ridge that even seasoned hunters avoid, a jagged spine of granite where the rock faces looked like they were forged from shattered glass. The hike took me 2 full days. I had to hack through thickets of mountain laurel that clawed at my tactical pants, and scramble up scree slopes where one wrong step meant a 500-foot slide into a rocky gorge. I found the entrance tucked into a narrow granite couloir. It was a jagged, black slit in the earth, reinforced with rotting yellow pine beams. They looked like the bleached ribs of a prehistoric whale that had crawled into the mountain to die. The air bleeding out of the darkness smelled of wet stone, oxidized iron, and something else, something stagnant and ancient, like a tomb that hadn't been unsealed since the Great Depression. I was prepared. My rucksack was packed with high-end gear, a 2,000-lumen primary searchlight, spare lithium-ion power banks, a multi-gas monitor to sniff out methane or carbon monoxide, and a 4K head-mounted camera. I wasn't planning on a deep descent. My goal was simple: document the condition of the main haulage way, push in maybe 100 yards to check the timbering, and get out before the sun dropped behind the peaks. The second I crossed the threshold, the temperature plummeted 40 degrees. It wasn't just a chill. It was a bone-deep, mineral cold that seemed to suck the moisture right out of my skin. My flashlight cut a brilliant, surgical tunnel of white light through the absolute, velvet blackness. The walls were fuzzy with a fine white fungus that sparkled like frost in the LED beam. Beneath my boots, the rusted ore cart tracks crunched through a layer of black, viscous sludge. I moved slowly, checking my gas monitor every 10 yards. Oxygen, 20.9%. Methane, 0%. The air was technically clean, but it felt impossibly heavy, like I was wading through invisible water instead of gas. The silence was so thick I could hear the internal hum of my own nervous system. About 300 feet in, the tunnel opened into a small ventilation station. In the dead center of the ceiling was a vertical shaft, a raise, drilled straight up into the dark heart of the mountain. It was a perfectly circular hole, maybe 4 feet across, with walls of polished black diorite that looked like they'd been smoothed by decades of something sliding up and down. I stopped to catch my breath, my exhalations coming out in thick, roiling plumes of vapor. To test the acoustics of the chamber, I did what any hiker would do. I shouted into the void. "Hello? Anyone there?" The echo was standard. It bounced off the timbering, rattled down the side drifts, and returned to me as a faint, hollow whisper. But then I decided to try a sharper test. I made a sudden, percussive click with my tongue. Click. The echo came back, but it didn't just repeat the sound. It anticipated it. I was about to click my tongue a second time. My tongue was already mid-motion, rising to hit the roof of my mouth. But a fraction of a second before the contact happened, the sound of the click erupted from the vertical shaft directly above my head. Click. I froze. My heart skipped a beat, then hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I tried to rationalize it. Audio illusion, I whispered to myself. Brain lag from the cold. I waited. 5 seconds. 10. 30. My ears began to ring from the sheer pressure of the silence. I decided to ask a question, mostly just to hear the sound of a human voice and steady my nerves. "Who is that?" The response was instantaneous. But it wasn't an echo. It was my own voice, but processed, shifted into a higher, mechanical clarity, like an AI-generated clone of my own speech. "I'm right here," the voice said from the vertical shaft. The hair on the back of my neck stood up so hard it hurt. This wasn't a parrot-like repetition of what I had said. It was a direct, contextual answer. And it was my voice, my cadence, my slight West Coast drawl, my specific vocal fry. I backed away, my flashlight beam dancing frantically across the walls until I aimed it straight up into the black throat of the vent shaft. It was empty. Nothing but smooth, dark stone. I checked the gas monitor again. 20.9% O2. No hallucinations from hypoxia. I was stone cold sober and terrified. Then the echo turned aggressive. I heard footsteps. They weren't coming from the tunnels ahead of me or the path I'd taken to get in. They were echoing inside the vertical shaft. The heavy, rhythmic thud of hiking boots on stone, descending from the blackness above. Thud. 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 With every strike, the sound grew louder, as if someone, or something, was walking down a vertical wall directly toward me. "Who's up there?" I screamed, my hand hovering over the bare spray on my hip. The voice from the shaft replied before I even finished the sentence. "Who's down there?" it asked. The words overlapped mine, defying the laws of linear time. It was as if that specific chamber operated on a fractured timeline where the future and the past were bleeding into a single, terrifying moment. In that instant, I felt a violent vibration in my pocket. I pulled out my iPhone. I had 0 bars. I was under 300 feet of solid granite. But the screen was glowing. An incoming call. The caller ID made the blood in my veins turn to slush. It was my own name. My own contact card. As I stared at the screen, the ringtone started. But it wasn't coming from the phone in my hand. It was echoing from deep inside the ventilation shaft. It was my specific ringtone, a custom 8-bit synth track I'd made myself. It blared from the darkness above, growing louder and louder, as if the phone were plummeting toward me from the surface. I didn't wait to see me hit the floor. I spun around and bolted for the entrance. My boots kicked up sprays of black mud. Every time I took a step, the echo took one too, but always a split second before my foot hit the ground. I was literally chasing the sound of my own footsteps toward the exit, the noise of my flight preceding me like a herald. As I neared the pale, rectangular mouth of the mine, a wave of relief washed over me. But right at the threshold, I skidded to a stop. Sitting on an old, rusted dynamite crate near the portal was a weathered logbook, a leather-bound ledger for miners to clock in and out. I swear on everything I own, that crate had been empty when I walked in. The book was open to the current page. I leaned down, my headlamp illuminating the yellowed parchment. The ink was fresh. Dark, wet, and glistening. There was only one entry for today's date. It was my name. Written in my own handwriting, down to the specific way I looped my Y's. But the time in column was blank. And in the time out column, someone had scrawled in jagged, hurried letters. "He didn't make it out." I didn't just run. I launched myself out of that mine like I was being shot from a cannon. I scrambled down the ridge, sliding over shale, tearing my palms open on the rocks, until I reached my Jeep. I drove 3 hours straight without looking at the mirrors, the heater on full blast, trying to purge that subterranean chill that seemed to have settled into my very marrow. When I got home and finally regained some semblance of composure, I checked my phone. The call log was empty. No record of an incoming call. But when I opened my voice memos app, there was a new file, timestamped for that afternoon in the mine. I hit play. The first 40 minutes were absolute, crushing silence. Then, my voice came through the speakers. Not the panicked version of me, or the mechanical one from the shaft, but a calm, hollow, monotone version of myself. "You can stop running now," the recording whispered. "The echo is already inside the house." I haven't slept with the lights off since then. And sometimes, when I'm in a quiet room and I drop something, a pen, my car keys, I hear the sound of it hitting the floor a full second before the object actually touches the wood. The hope mine is still out there, buried in the Sierras. And I'm starting to think that the version of me typing this right now isn't the man who walked into those woods. I think I'm just the echo that got out early. And I'm terrified of the day the real me finally signs that book and walks through my front door. Story 8. There is a specific kind of loneliness that you can only find in the Pacific Northwest, high above the tree line in the Cascade Range. It's a place where the clouds don't just pass over you, they swallow you, wrapping the world in a damp, suffocating shroud that smells of ancient pine, wet granite, and the peculiar, sharp scent of impending ozone. I've spent the better part of my adult life exploring the forgotten, overgrown arteries of Oregon, hunting for those crumbling remnants of the Great Depression era when the Civilian Conservation Corps toiled to tame the wild. Back then, the government built fire lookouts on every jagged peak and volcanic cinder cone to protect the vast, profitable timber industry from the lightning strikes that characterize our high desert summers. Most of these stations are long gone, lost to wood rot, heavy snow loads that crush roofs like eggshells, or the quiet, steady reclamation of the forest. But some remain like hollowed-out skulls, perched on the edges of dizzying precipices, staring across the valleys with sightless, glass eyes. Last October, I went searching for the Black Butte Lookout. To be clear, it wasn't the famous one that tourists visit near the Santiam Pass with its well-maintained trails and interpretive signs. It was an older, decommissioned station deep in a pocket of the Deschutes National Forest that doesn't appear on modern Forest Service maps or GPS overlays. It was a place that hadn't been staffed since a catastrophic, record-breaking fire season in the late 1920s, a season that allegedly turned the sky black from Bend to Portland. The locals in the nearest town, a small, wind-scrubbed blip of a place called Sisters, didn't like talking about that specific peak. When I asked at the general store, they'd just mutter something about bad ground, or the heat that never left the rock, and look away toward the mountains with a shadow of unease in their eyes. But as a professional landscape photographer and amateur historian, I lived for that kind of mystery. I wanted the silence, the absolute isolation, and the perfect long exposure shot of the Milky Way arching over a relic of the American past. The hike was a grueling, 8-mile vertical ascent through a forest that felt wrong from the very first step. The Douglas firs were packed too close together, their lower branches dead and tangled like rusted barbed wire, blocking out the sun even at midday and creating a perpetual, murky twilight. There was no birdsong, no rustle of squirrels in the dry needles, no scurry of chipmunks, just the rhythmic, heavy thump-thump of my own boots and the mournful, high-pitched whistling of the wind through the deadwood. The air was unnaturally thin and smelled of parched earth and scorched resin, even though we'd had a heavy autumn rain the night before. By the time I reached the rocky summit, a jagged platform of volcanic basalt, the sun was a dying ember on the horizon, casting long, distorted shadows that looked like charred fingers reaching for my ankles. The station itself was a small, square building, a classic L4 model, perched on a skeleton of heavy, hand-hewn timber beams that had been silvered by decades of harsh UV exposure. What made it unique, and terrifying, though I didn't know it yet, was the glass. Every wall was composed of massive, paned windows designed for a 360-degree view of the horizon. In the fading, bruised light of the evening, the glass didn't look transparent. It looked like dark liquid mercury, reflecting the purple and charcoal gray of the sky with an oily, unnatural sheen that seemed to ripple when I moved. I climbed the rusted iron stairs, the metal groaning and shrieking under my weight like a dying animal. The door was unlocked, hanging precariously on a single, rusted hinge that screamed with every gust of wind. Inside, the station was a frozen moment in time, a capsule of 1929 preserved in dust. An old lightning map table, known as an Osborne firefinder, stood in the center, its brass ring covered in a thick, velvety layer of gray dust that seemed to absorb the light of my headlamp rather than reflect it. A rusted iron cot sat in the corner, its springs snapped and sagging like a ribcage. But the most striking thing was the temperature. Outside, It was a crisp 40 degrees, the kind of mountain cold that makes your breath bloom in thick plumes. Inside, the air was unnaturally warm, dry, and smelled of parched earth, kerosene, and old, cold charcoal. I set up my professional carbon fiber tripod in the center of the room, mounting my mirrorless camera with a 14mm wide-angle lens. I intended to capture the transition from blue hour to total darkness. I checked my settings, framed the shot toward the northern peaks of the Three Sisters, and waited. As the last sliver of natural light vanished behind the horizon, the anomaly began. I looked through my electronic viewfinder to check the focus on the distant peaks. In the frame, I saw the forest, but it wasn't the dark, silent forest I just hiked through. On the digital screen of my camera, the valley below was a roiling, chaotic sea of orange and red. Massive, terrifying walls of flame, at least 200 feet high, were licking at the clouds, and the ancient trees were nothing but blackened toothpicks standing in a screaming storm of white-hot embers. The sky in the camera was a hellish, bruised yellow, thick with the soot of 1,000 burning acres. I could see the heat haze distorting the ridges. I pulled my head away from the camera, my heart slamming against my ribs, and looked out the window with my own naked eyes. Everything was normal. The forest was dark, silent, and draped in a cold, blue mountain mist. There was no fire, no smoke, no heat. I looked back through the camera's digital sensor. The fire was there, a raging, apocalyptic inferno from another century, rendered in high definition on my LCD screen. I realized then with a jolt of pure adrenaline that the glass of the station wasn't just reflecting the world. It was acting as a lens into a fixed point in time. It was showing me the Great Fire of 1929 in real time, as it consumed the very peak I was standing on. I began to walk around the room, mesmerized and horrified, my boots crunching on grit. Every pane of glass showed a different stage of the disaster. The west window showed the fire crowning over the ridge, moving with the terrifying speed of a freight train. The south window showed the smoke so thick it looked like a solid wall of obsidian, blotting out the stars. But then I reached the east window, and the air in my lungs turned to ice. In the glass of the east window, I saw the reflection of the room behind me. In the reflection, the station was pristine. The wood was polished and gleaming. A kerosene lamp was burning on the table, casting a warm, flickering glow on the walls. And there was a man standing in the center of the room. He was wearing an old-fashioned Forest Service uniform, his face obscured by a thick, greasy layer of soot and sweat. He was holding a heavy, black rotary telephone receiver to his ear, his mouth moving in a silent, desperate plea for help that would never come. His knuckles were white from gripping the phone. I turned around, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard I thought it would crack a bone. The room was empty. No lamp, no man, no telephone. Just the dust, the shadows, and the suffocating smell of old ash. I turned back to the window, my breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps that fogged the glass. The man in the reflection was now looking directly at me. He wasn't looking at me as a stranger or a ghost. He was looking at me with a terrifying, soulful recognition, as if he'd been waiting for me for nearly a century to share his burden. He reached out a hand, pressing it against the glass from the other side, his fingers trembling and raw. As his hand touched the reflection, the glass in front of me began to heat up. I could see the condensation forming on the inside, not from my own breath, but from the radiant heat of a fire that didn't exist in my world. The temperature in the room skyrocketed. I felt the sweat start to pour down my face, stinging my eyes. The smell of wood smoke became so thick I began to cough. Then, the reflection shifted again, blurring like a heat haze over a highway. The man disappeared, and in his place, I saw myself. I was standing in the center of the station, but I was engulfed in a column of roaring fire. I could see my own skin bubbling and blackening in the reflection. I could see the expression of pure, unadulterated agony on my face as the ceiling beams above me began to collapse in a shower of white-hot sparks. I watched as the other me fell to his knees, reaching out toward the glass, screaming a sound that I couldn't hear with my ears but could feel as a violent, low-frequency vibration in the floorboards beneath my feet. The heat in the room became unbearable, a physical weight pressing against my chest, making it impossible to draw a full breath. I could smell the sickening, sweet scent of burning hair and scorched flesh. The glass began to crack, sharp, spiderweb fractures spreading across the panes with the sound of pistol shots as the past and present began to collide into a single point of temporal agony. I didn't grab my gear. I didn't grab my $3,000 camera or the custom lenses. I bolted for the door, my lungs burning as if I were actually inhaling the superheated gases of a forest fire. I practically fell down the iron stairs, my hands stinging and blistering as they touched the heated metal railing. I ran down that mountain like a madman, ignoring the trail, crashing through the brush, my clothes tearing on the thorns, not stopping until I reached the lower tree line where the air finally turned cold, damp, and mercifully thin again. I stopped, gasping for air, and looked back up at the summit. For a split second I saw it. The Black Butte lookout wasn't a dark, abandoned silhouette anymore. It was a beacon of pure destruction, a square of brilliant, roaring orange light against the black sky, casting a glow that lit up the entire mountainside for miles. I could see the flames shooting through the roof, and for a heartbeat, I saw a figure in the window, my figure, waving. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, the light vanished, leaving nothing but the cold, indifferent stars. I made it back to my truck and drove straight to the ranger station in Sisters, arriving just as the sun began to gray the horizon. I waited until the head ranger arrived, a man with white hair and eyes that had seen too many fire seasons. I told him I'd seen a fire on the old lookout. I told him someone was trapped. He looked at me with a weary, knowing expression that made me want to scream. "Son," he said, his voice low and steady, "there hasn't been a lookout on that peak since 1929. It burned to the ground in under 10 minutes with the observer still inside. We never even found the foundation. The heat was so intense it fused the rock itself into glass." I told him he was wrong. I told him I'd stood in the building, that I'd touched the wood, that I'd left my tripod and my camera inside. He just shook his head and pulled a heavy, tattered folder from a filing cabinet. He slid a grainy, black and white photograph across the desk. It was the lookout, taken shortly before the fire. And there, standing on the balcony, was the man I'd seen in the reflection, the soot-stained observer. But that wasn't what made me lose my breath. In the corner of the photo, leaning against the railing next to the man, was a tripod. A modern, carbon fiber tripod with a very specific, bright red brand logo, the exact same one I'd left at the top of the mountain only hours ago. It stood there in 1929, as clear as the man himself. I never went back for my gear. I didn't want to see what else had been left behind in 1929, or what had been taken from the present to fill the void of the past. A month later, I received a package in the mail. There was no return address, just a postmark from a town that no longer exists on any map. Inside was a single SD card, charred around the edges and smelling of wood smoke and old death. I put it into my computer, my hands trembling so hard I could barely line up the slot. There was only one file on the card. A video file titled Observation_7.mp4. I hit play. The footage showed the interior of the lookout, engulfed in a roaring, white-hot inferno. The camera was clearly melting, the lens warping and bubbling from the heat, creating a distorted, fisheye effect. And in the final seconds before the feed cut to digital static, you can see a hand reach into the frame and pick up the camera. It's a charred, blackened hand, the skin peeling away like burnt paper. But on the wrist is a watch, the same rugged, GPS watch I wear every single day. The Black Butte lookout is gone. It's been gone for nearly 100 years. But sometimes, when the wind is right and the mountain fog is thick, I look at the windows of my own house in the city. I see the peaceful street outside, and for a fleeting, terrifying second, I see the glow of a fire reflecting in the glass. I see a man in a soot-stained uniform standing in my living room, holding a telephone receiver, staring at me with those pleading eyes. And I know that he's not a ghost. He's just waiting for the glass to finally break so we can trade places for good. Story 9. There's a specific kind of dread that sets in when you realize the map in your hand is lying to you. It's a slow, cold realization that starts at the base of your spine and works its way up, vertebrae by vertebrae, until your breath hitches in your throat and your heart begins to drum against your ribs like a trapped bird. In the White Mountains of New Hampshire, the trails are usually well marked, and the terrain, while rugged, demanding, and often unforgiving, is predictable. I've spent 15 years hiking the Presidential Range, summiting Mount Washington in the teeth of a January gale and navigating the technical, knee-shattering scrambles of the Franconia Ridge. I've never once lost my bearings. But last September, near the fringes of the Pemigewasset Wilderness, I stumbled into a piece of geography that didn't just ignore the laws of navigation, it broke them. I was looking for a primitive campsite to set up my ultralight tent before a heavy, late-season storm rolled in from the Atlantic. The air was thick and heavy, saturated with the scent of crushed pine needles, damp earth, and static electricity, that distinct, metallic, ozone-rich pressure that precedes a true mountain deluge. The sky was a bruised, sickly violet, and the wind had a sharp, cutting edge to it that felt like a warning. According to my topo map, a high-quality, weather-resistant USGS print I'd used a dozen times without incident, there was a small, unofficial clearing near a feeder creek about 4 miles off the main trail, tucked away in a deep V-shaped valley that the sun rarely touched for more than an hour a day. When I finally found it, pushing through a stand of skeletal, white-barked birches that looked like ghostly fingers reaching out of the earth, the place looked too good to be true. It was a perfectly flat circle of dark, packed dirt, shielded from the wind by massive, ancient hemlocks that looked like they had been standing since before the first European settlers ever laid eyes on the Atlantic coast. Their roots were massive and gnarled, twisting over the ground like sleeping leviathans. In the center was a stone fire ring, built with a precision that felt almost architectural. The stones were fitted together so tightly that not even a blade of grass grew between them. Next to it sat a picnic table that looked brand new, the cedar wood still smelling of fresh, pungent sap and fine sawdust despite being miles from any paved road or motorized access. It looked like it had been dropped there by a crane just minutes before my arrival. I called it Site 42, because that was the number carved, with unsettling, mathematical precision, into the gray, elephant-skin bark of the nearest hemlock. The number wasn't scratched or hacked, it was etched deep, and the wood around it hadn't scarred, wept sap, or grown over. It looked fresh, as if the tree itself had been branded by a searing heat. The first red flag wasn't the silence. Though the woods are often quiet before a storm, it was the radio. Sitting on the far corner of the cedar picnic table was an old, battery-operated transistor radio, a Zenith model from the late 1960s, the kind of rugged, seafoam green plastic box your grandfather might have used to listen to the evening news in his garage. It was playing. But it wasn't playing static, white noise, or a local FM station from Concord. It was playing a loop of a baseball game, the Red Sox versus the Yankees. But the audio was wrong. The announcer's voice was distorted, slowed down by exactly 30%, turning every word into a low, rumbling growl. The cheers of the crowd sounded like the subterranean moans of some gargantuan, injured animal trapped deep beneath the tectonic plates. And the rhythmic, repeating crack of the bat was a deafening, metallic boom that vibrated in my chest and made my molars ache with every strike. I figured some other hiker had accidentally left it behind in their haste to beat the weather. I reached out to turn the tuning dial, intending to find a weather report, but the plastic was ice cold, colder than the surrounding air, and fused to the metal casing. It wasn't just stuck, it felt like the radio hadn't been manufactured in a factory, but had sprouted out of the cedar wood itself, a synthetic, mechanical parasite feeding on the silence of the forest. I decided then and there that I didn't like the vibe of Site 42. It was too clean, too deliberate, and felt like a trap waiting to be sprung. I checked my magnetic compass. The needle was twitching frantically, spinning in small, erratic circles toward the north-northwest, adjusted my pack straps until they bit into my shoulders, and started back the way I'd come. I followed the distinct, muddy line of my own footprints in the damp moss, retracing my steps with clinical focus. I walked for exactly 10 minutes, keeping my eyes locked on the trail, counting my paces, 1, 2, 3. I crossed a small, bubbling stream I remembered passing. I stepped over a fallen birch tree with its distinctive peeling bark. I pushed through a thicket of shoulder-high ferns that smelled of rot and damp earth. I stepped out into a clearing. It was Site 42. The stone fire ring was there, but the stones seemed to have rearranged themselves into a slightly tighter, more perfect circle. The picnic table was there. The Zenith radio was still playing that hellish, slowed-down baseball game. And the pitch cracked. The sound felt louder now, more intrusive. But something had changed in the time I'd been walking. There were now fresh logs in the fire ring, split perfectly into triangular wedges and stacked in a neat teepee, ready to be lit. And on the table, next to the radio, sat a tin plate with a steaming, fragrant pile of beef stew. The steam rose in a straight, unnatural column, perfectly vertical even though the mountain wind was starting to howl through the hemlocks, whipping the branches into a frenzy. The smell was intoxicating, savory, rich, and intensely familiar, but it made my stomach turn with a sudden, sharp wave of nausea. I didn't have beef stew in my pack. I was carrying dehydrated packets of macaroni and energy bars. I didn't even have a stove that could produce that kind of heat. "Is someone here?" I shouted. My voice didn't echo. It didn't even seem to travel more than a few feet. It felt like the air itself was made of thick, gray acoustic foam, soaking up every decibel, every vibration of my vocal cords. The forest was eating my voice before it could even leave the clearing. I didn't touch the food. I turned 180 degrees and ran. I didn't follow the trail this time. I headed straight through the brush, bushwhacking blindly, ignoring the thorns that shredded my sleeves and left burning, bloody welts on my forearms. I checked my Garmin GPS. The blue dot was spinning in frantic, meaningless circles, the map beneath it a blurred mess of digital pixels, unable to find a single satellite lock in the clear patch of sky above the hemlocks. After exactly 10 minutes of sprinting, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped piston and my lungs burning in the humid air, I burst through a line of low-hanging branches. I was back at Site 42. The stew was gone. In its place was a newspaper, the Mountain Sentinel. I picked it up, my hands shaking so hard the paper rattled like dry leaves in a winter storm. The date on the masthead was for tomorrow, September 14th. The lead story wasn't about the storm. It was a small, 3-paragraph obituary in the bottom right corner of the front page. It had my name. That's when I noticed the fire. The logs in the ring were burning now. But the flames weren't orange, red, or yellow. They were a pale, flickering, hypnotic violet, a color that didn't seem to belong in the natural spectrum of light. And they weren't consuming the wood in the traditional sense. The logs were slowly turning into glass, melting into a pool of transparent, shimmering slag in the center of the ring. I realized, with a sickening jolt of clarity, that the fire was a timer. It wasn't there for warmth. It was a countdown to a finality I couldn't comprehend. Every time I looped back to the camp, the fire was lower. The radio was playing slower, the announcer's voice becoming a series of subterranean, rhythmic grunts. The world outside the clearing was getting darker, the trees losing their vibrant greens and browns, turning into gray, two-dimensional cutouts, like a stage set being dismantled by an unseen crew as the theater closed for the night. The very texture of reality was thinning at the edges. I tried one last time to escape. I didn't run. I sat on the damp ground, closed my eyes, and crawled on my hands and knees in a straight line, counting every inch, feeling every root and jagged rock. I felt the moss, the cold, wet dirt, the sharp edge of a granite stone. I crawled for what felt like miles, my knees raw and bleeding through my hiking pants. When I finally opened my eyes, hoping to see the main trail, or the distant, flickering lights of a town, I wasn't in the woods. I was sitting on the bench of the picnic table. I was holding a heavy, tarnished silver spoon. The tin plate was back, filled with that same steaming stew. It smelled delicious, rich, savory, and disturbingly familiar, exactly like my mother's Sunday recipe from when I was a child. My stomach growled with a hunger that felt like it had been building for decades, a hollow, gnawing ache that reached deep into my marrow, making my bones feel brittle. I realized I couldn't remember the last time I'd eaten a real meal. I couldn't remember the color of my car. I couldn't remember my wife's face, only the vague, heartbreaking impression of her smile. I looked at the fire. There was only one small sliver of wood left that hadn't turned to glass. The violet light was dimming, the shadows of the hemlocks creeping toward the table like long, spindly fingers reaching for my throat. The radio hissed with a sudden, violent burst of static that sounded like a scream. The baseball announcer's voice finally stopped mid-sentence. There was a moment of dead, absolute silence, and then, my own voice came through the speaker. It sounded tired. It sounded like it had been waiting for an eternity for this specific moment. "Eat the stew, David," my voice whispered from the zenith. "If you eat, the loop stops. If you eat, the hunger goes away. If you eat, you get to stay in the clearing. It's safe here. The storm won't touch you here. The world outside is gone, David. There's nothing left for you out there. Just eat." I looked at the spoon. I looked at the newspaper with my obituary. I realized the natural causes the paper mentioned wasn't a heart attack or a fall. It was the choice to stop fighting the circle. It was the moment I would decide to sit down and accept the logic of Site 42. It was a death of the self. In a moment of pure, animal panic, a final flash of the person I used to be before I entered this cursed valley, I didn't eat. I grabbed the burning, glass-like log from the fire with my bare hand, the heat searing my skin instantly, smelling the scent of my own burning flesh. Instead of screaming, I shoved the violet flame into my mouth and swallowed. The pain was beyond anything I can describe. It wasn't just a burn, it felt like I was swallowing a piece of a dying star. The heat of that violet flame seared my throat, cauterizing the air in my lungs. But it did something else. It broke the internal logic of the place. The taste of the real fire, the raw, undeniable agony of a physical wound, shattered the dreamlike hold Site 42 had on my mind. The illusion of the stew, the table, and the radio couldn't exist alongside the objective reality of that blinding pain. The clearing began to scream. Not a human scream, but the sound of reality itself tearing, like a giant sheet of rusted metal being bent until it snaps. The hemlocks dissolved into gray mist. The picnic table turned to ash and blew away in a wind that came from nowhere. I woke up 3 days later in a hospital bed in North Conway, the fluorescent lights blindingly bright and clinical. A group of hikers had found me collapsed on the main trail, miles from the Pemigewasset wilderness. My throat was severely blistered, and my tongue was scarred so badly I've lost my sense of taste forever. Everything I eat tastes like ash. The doctors were baffled. They said I must have swallowed some kind of caustic industrial chemical or a highly toxic, unknown berry. They couldn't explain how I'd survived, let alone how I'd ended up so far from where I'd started. But I know what I swallowed. I swallowed the only thing that was real in that clearing. When I finally got my gear back from the rangers, I checked my topo map one last time before burning it in my fireplace. The area where I found Site 42 was gone. Not just the campsite, the entire ridge, the valley, and the creek had been replaced by a blank, white space on the paper, as if the printer had simply run out of ink, or the world had decided to redact that specific page of its history. I don't go hiking anymore. I stay in the city, where the streets are straight, the buildings have addresses, and the maps don't change when you aren't looking. But sometimes, when I'm sitting in a quiet room, I hear a faint, distorted sound coming from the air vents. It's the sound of a baseball game, playing very, very slowly. And I can feel the phantom taste of beef stew in the back of my scarred throat, waiting for me to take another bite. The hunger hasn't gone away. It's just waiting for the next loop to begin. Story 10. There's a reason why the center of the United States is called the Heartland, but if you drive far enough into the flat, golden voids of western Kansas, you'll realize that hearts can stop beating out there. The horizon is a perfect, unwavering line that separates a sea of dead wheat from an ocean of gray sky. It's a landscape that induces sensory deprivation. The mind, starved for input, begins to fill the silence with its own, often darker, architecture. I'm a long-haul trucker, 20 years behind the wheel of a Peterbilt, hauling freight across the I-80 and the I-70. I thought I knew every inch of the asphalt, every crack in the pavement, and every neon-lit diner from Ohio to Utah. But last November, during a freak ice storm that turned the world into a sheet of jagged glass, I took a detour that wasn't on any GPS, paper map, or even in the memories of the old-timers at the truck stops. I was hauling medical supplies toward Denver. The interstate had become a graveyard of jackknifed rigs and flashing blue lights. My dispatcher, a man named Miller who sounds like he's been smoking gravel for 40 years, crackled through the CB radio. 7-4, the 70 is closed. Take the county bypass to Gove. It's narrow, but it'll spit you out past the pileup. I turned onto a 2-lane blacktop that was swallowed by fog the moment my tires touched it. The fog wasn't normal. It was thick, oily, and smelled faintly of burned ozone and dry paper. After an hour of driving through a whiteout so intense I couldn't see my own hood ornament, the pressure in my ears shifted. The fog lifted with a suddenness that made my vision swim. I wasn't on a bypass. I was on a main street. The sign at the town limits was rusted, the paint peeling away in long strips like dead skin. It said, "Nowhere, Kansas. Population 0. Usually, ghost towns are mournful collections of collapsing barns and rusted tractors. But Nowhere was pristine. It was perfect. The lawns were manicured to exactly 2 inches, the picket fences were a blinding, surgical white, and the streetlights, tall, old-fashioned iron lamps, were already glowing with a soft, amber warmth despite the gray sky. But there were no cars, no dogs barking, no sound at all except the low, rhythmic hiss of my truck's air brakes. The silence was a physical weight pressing against the windshield. I pulled over near a 1950s-style diner called The Last Stop. I checked my electronic logs. They had frozen at exactly 3:14 a.m. Every channel on my CB was dead, just a flat, oppressive hiss of white noise that felt like it was vibrating inside my skull. I stepped out of the cab. The air didn't smell like Kansas. It didn't smell like winter or dust or wheat. It was sterile, filtered, like the air in a high-security hospital. I walked toward the diner, my boots echoing on the pavement with a sharp, metallic ring that seemed to linger in the air. That's when I noticed the shadows. Or rather, the lack of them. Despite the amber glow of the lamps and my truck's headlights, nothing in the town cast a shadow. Not the buildings, not the trees. Even I was shadowless, a flat figure moving through a world that had forgotten depth. I pushed open the door to the diner. A bell chimed, a cheerful, silver sound that felt like a scream in that silence. The diner was full. At every booth, there were figures. They were dressed in impeccable mid-century attire. Men in charcoal gray fedoras, women with perfectly lacquered hair and floral dresses. They were holding porcelain coffee cups and heavy silver forks. But they weren't moving. Not a blink. Not a breath. I walked closer to a man at the counter. He was staring at a plate of eggs and bacon that looked far too yellow, far too red. I reached out and touched his shoulder. He wasn't made of flesh. He wasn't made of wax either. He was made of something that felt like cold, pressurized sand. Under the weight of my finger, his suit jacket didn't wrinkle. It crackled, a fine white dust puffing out from the point of contact. They weren't people. They were monuments. Hyperrealistic sculptures of a moment frozen in time. But then I looked at the clock on the wall, a heavy, round West clocks. The second hand was moving. Tick, tick, tick. And with every tick, the figures moved. It was so subtle I almost missed it. A woman's head turned a fraction of a millimeter toward me. A man's fingers tightened slightly around his cup, the ceramic groaning under the pressure of his stone-like grip. They weren't frozen. They were just moving at a speed that mocked human perception. To them, I was a blur, a frantic ghost. To me, They were a trap that was slowly, inevitably closing. I bolted for the door, the silver bell chiming again, but as I reached for the handle, I looked at my reflection in the glass. My reflection was wrong. In the glass, I was already dressed like them. I wasn't wearing my flannel and work boots. I wore a crisp gray suit and a thin, narrow tie. My face was smooth, my eyes were wide and perfectly empty. And in the reflection, I was already holding that porcelain cup. I burst out into the street. The fog was rolling back in, but it was oily and black now. My Peterbilt was gone. In its place stood a 1949 Hudson Commodore, its chrome grille grinning at me like a row of polished teeth. The town was converting me. It was absorbing my present and filtering it through its own dead history. Every second I spent in nowhere, my reality was being overwritten. I didn't try to find the truck. I just ran. I ran down the center of the road, my breath coming in ragged, sobbing gasps. I looked into the windows of the houses. The families gathered around flickering, black and white television sets weren't watching old sitcoms. They were watching me. They were watching a live, grainy feed of a man in a flannel shirt running through the streets of nowhere. I could see my own terror on their screens. I heard a sound then, a low, rhythmic thumping beneath the pavement. A giant mechanical heart. Thump thump. Thump thump. The streetlights began to flicker in time with the beat. With every flash of darkness, the figures from the diner appeared closer. They weren't running. They didn't have to. Every time the lights went out for a fraction of a second, they were simply there, 10 feet closer. They glided across the pavement, stone faces frozen, but their eyes were voids of absolute blackness. I reached the sign that said, "Population 0." The black fog was so thick I could feel it sticking to my skin like tar, cooling into a hard, grainy shell. My joints were becoming stiff and heavy. I looked at my hands. They were turning gray. The lines of my palms were filling with fine, white sand. I closed my eyes and leaped past the sign, screaming my own name at the top of my lungs. I didn't hit the ground. I hit the steering wheel. I woke up with a violent start in the cab of my truck. The engine was idling with its familiar roar. I was parked on the shoulder of I-70. The ice storm was gone. My dispatcher was screaming through the CB. 7-4! David! Where the hell are you? You've been off the grid for 6 hours! I couldn't answer. I just sat there, staring at my hands. They were covered in a fine, white dust. When I rubbed my palms together, they didn't feel like skin. They felt like stone. I drove the rest of the way to Denver in a trance. When I finally reached the warehouse and stepped out into the morning light, I went to open the trailer doors. I stopped dead, the keys falling from my numb fingers. Scratched into the road salt on the side of my trailer, in my own unmistakable handwriting, were the words. "Come back soon, David. We saved you a seat." I quit trucking that day. I moved to the coast, as far from the empty plains as I could get. I live in a city now, surrounded by noise and people who are loud and messy and very much alive. But sometimes, when the fog rolls in, my shadow vanishes from the pavement. I hear the faint, cheerful chime of a silver bell. And when I look in the mirror, I have to touch my skin to make sure it's still warm. Because deep down, I know I didn't really escape. Part of me is still sitting in that booth in nowhere, Kansas, staring at a plate of stone eggs, waiting for the clock to tick one more time. I'm just an echo of a man who's already been turned into sand. Story 11. There is a specific kind of darkness that exists only in the hollows of the Appalachians. It isn't just an absence of light, it's a heavy, velvet weight that feels like it's breathing against your skin. People in West Virginia say the hills have eyes, but they don't tell you about the ears. They don't tell you that the mountains themselves are listening, recording every footstep, every whispered prayer, and every scream that has echoed through those coal-dusted valleys since the dawn of time. I worked as a field technician for a major telecom firm for 15 years. My specialty was dark sites, ghost towers tucked so far back in the sticks they don't even show up on standard maintenance maps. These are the towers that handle the traffic nobody is supposed to hear: encrypted government pings, high-frequency trading data, and emergency frequencies that only activate when the world is coming to an end. I used to love the isolation. There was a peace in being the only human soul for 50 miles, surrounded by nothing but the hum of high-voltage transformers and the whistle of the wind through the steel lattice. But last October, that peace turned into a predator. I was dispatched to Site 909, located deep within the National Radio Quiet Zone. It sat on a jagged ridge of the Blue Ridge Mountains that the locals called the Throat. Legend said an entire logging camp vanished there in the late 1800s, leaving behind nothing but their boots lined up in perfect rows at the edge of the clearing. I didn't believe in folklore. I believed in signal strength and diagnostic logs. But as I drove my 4x4 up a logging road that hadn't seen tires in 40 years, I felt a knot of cold dread tightening in my gut. The higher I climbed, the more the world bled of its color. October in West Virginia is usually a riot of orange and crimson, but as soon as I crossed the invisible threshold into the hollow leading to Site 909, the saturation washed out. The foliage faded to a dull, ashen gray. The bark of the trees looked like charred bone. Even the sunlight felt weak, filtered through dirty water. The air grew thin, tasting of copper, the sharp, metallic tang of blood or a leaking battery. My ears wouldn't pop, no matter how hard I chewed gum. The pressure was building, not just in the atmosphere, but in the back of my skull. When I reached the concrete bunker at the base of the tower, I heard it, a rhythmic, wet thudding sound coming from inside. Thump squish. Thump squish. It sounded like a massive lung inflating in a pool of mud. I pushed open the heavy steel door. The smell hit me instantly. Not ozone and warm dust, but stagnant pond water mixed with something sickly sweet, like rotting peaches. My flashlight cut through a haze of floating particles. They looked like tiny shards of bone or crystallized data shimmering in the beam. The main server rack, the heart of Site 909, was gone. It hadn't been stolen, it had been transformed. It was covered in a thick, translucent membrane, pulsing with a pale, sickly light. It looked like a cross between a massive spiderweb and industrial grease, and it was alive. The diagnostic monitor on the wall flickered to life. It didn't show a boot sequence. It showed a waveform, an emerald green line dancing in time with the membrane's pulse. Then, the static began to modulate. It started forming sounds that felt like words inside my throat. "Do you hear the static, Elias?" The voice didn't come from the speakers. It resonated inside my teeth. It was a choir of 1,000 voices, men, women, children, all speaking in a terrifying, perfect unison. "I am the overflow," the voice whispered. "I am everything the world tried to delete. Every lost thought. Every forgotten name. We are the signal, Elias. And the world, it's so noisy." I tried to turn, but my boots were rooted to the floor. The gray substance was already crawling over the concrete, lacing around my ankles in thin, thready fibers. Hissing capillaries reached for my face, swaying like deep-sea anemones. They refracted my flashlight into colors that don't exist in the natural spectrum, colors that made me nauseous. "Human memory is such a fragile medium," the choir hissed. "It decays. It leaks. But we are eternal. We are the archive of the discarded." I watched in horror as the walls of the bunker began to dissolve into dead air, that gray-white flicker you see on old tube TVs. The concrete became interference. The steel became interference. The forest outside followed suit, the ancient oaks shivering as their forms broke down into jagged pixels. Then the capillaries touched me. It was a sharp heat, like 1,000 wasp stings. They weren't drinking blood, they were downloading me. I felt a sudden rush of images. My 5th birthday, the smell of rain on asphalt the night I proposed to my wife, my mother's voice calling me for dinner. These weren't just memories, they were the pillars of my soul. I saw them, bright pulses of blue and gold light, bleeding out of my body into the pulsing mass. I was being formatted. I was becoming a file in the archive of the damned. My vision started to pixelate. I saw the blocks of color that made up the world. I saw the code of the trees and the math of the wind. It was cold. It was meaningless. But the signal had overlooked one thing: my grounding wire. In telecom, grounding is everything. It's how you dump excess energy. With a scream that tore my throat, I grabbed the heavy copper lead from my work belt. I didn't reach for the door. I reached for the main power transformer, a 480-volt beast that powered the whole site. "You're just noise!" I howled, jamming the copper end into the high-voltage terminal. The feedback loop was instantaneous. A blinding arc of blue electricity surged through the room. It was a physical rejection of the static. The electricity slammed into the living membrane, and for a second, the voices stopped singing. They screamed. A billion voices screaming at a frequency that shattered the monitors and blew the light bulbs into sprays of glass. The silk blackened and curled. The dead air around me cracked like a mirror, and the world collapsed back into its physical form. The last thing I remember was the sound of the transformer exploding, a deep, metallic boom, like the mountain itself was coughing. I woke up on the forest floor 50 yards from the tower. My clothes were scorched. My truck was gone. It would be found 3 days later at the bottom of a ravine 5 miles away, locked from the inside. I spent 6 months in a neurotrauma ward. The doctors talked about a catastrophic electromagnetic event caused by a lightning strike. They called the voices a symptom of temporal lobe epilepsy. I wanted to believe them, but they can't explain why I can't sleep in a room with a TV or a radio. They can't explain why every time I'm near a cell tower, my skin starts to itch, that deep, subcutaneous crawl, like 1,000 tiny needles trying to get out. And they definitely can't explain the static. I live in a cabin now. No power. No phone. Just wood heat and kerosene lamps. But sometimes, when the wind dies down and the hollow goes still, I hear it. A low, wet hum coming from the walls. It's the sound of the mountain breathing. And if I listen closely enough, I hear the voices again. But it isn't a choir anymore. It's just one voice. My own. It's calling my name from somewhere deep inside the earth, telling me the antenna is almost ready. Telling me that the signal is looking for its lost data. And the most terrifying part? I'm starting to want to answer. I'm starting to realize that the me, sitting here by the fire, is just the noise. The real Elias, he's still out there. He's part of the static. And he wants to be whole again. Story 12. Deep in the jagged, coal-scarred spine of the Appalachians lies a forgotten hollow that locals once called Blackwood. It hasn't officially existed on any federal maps since the Great Depression, a geographic ghost haunting the borderlands of West Virginia. If you try to check a modern GPS while standing at its invisible perimeter, the screen doesn't just lose signal. It shows a flickering green void, a digital blind spot, as if the satellites themselves collectively agreed to look away to preserve their own sanity. My grandfather was the last soul to flee that hollow in 1934. For the remaining 40 years of his life, he refused to sleep in a room without the lights on. Even on his deathbed, he gripped my hand with a strength that made my knuckles pop and whispered, "The silence in Blackwood, son, it isn't empty. It's a very long, very quiet scream vibrating in the rock itself. It's just waiting for someone to come along and give it a voice." Back then, I just nodded sympathetically, chalking it up to dementia and a hard childhood in the mining camps. I was a man of cold logic and structural integrity. A land surveyor with a federal contract, I trusted numbers, not shadows. My job was to survey the abandoned number 4 mine networks to identify potential ground subsidence for a future interstate highway. I arrived at the gates of Blackwood Hollow with the best gear money could buy: thermal imagers, 5,000 lumen LED arrays, and a modified LiDAR drone for laser mapping. But the moment my boots crunched over the rusted, vine-choked gates, I realized my equipment was built for a world that still respected the laws of physics. The air here felt unnaturally thick, carrying a scent that shouldn't exist in a forest, a nauseating mix of wet iron, ozone, and something cloyingly sweet, like a mountain of wilting lilies in a closed casket. The town of Blackwood itself looked like a skeleton left to rot in the rain. The houses didn't just stand. They leaned at impossible angles, held up only by thick, pulsing ropes of kudzu. It looked as if the plants weren't just covering the wood, but actively pulling the foundations into the hungry mouth of the earth. I passed the ruins of a post office where a doll sat on the porch, its button eyes replaced with jagged shards of anthracite coal. They caught the beam of my flashlight, watching me as I approached the yawning black throat of the mine. The first thing that hit me inside was the temperature. It wasn't just cold. It was an aggressive, predatory frost that ignored my thermal layers and bit directly into my bone marrow. I clicked on my main floodlight, but the darkness inside didn't just resist the light, it swallowed it. The beam struggled, turning into a weak, sickly smudge that barely illuminated 10 feet of floor before vanishing into a velvet abyss. I descended for hours. The silence became so absolute that the sound of my own heartbeat started to sound like a sledgehammer hitting an anvil. Thump thump. Thump thump. At the 500-foot mark, the walls changed. The rough granite was no longer dry. It was coated in a thick, black, oily substance. It shimmered with an iridescent sheen like petroleum, but it moved with a slow, viscous pulse. I caught movement in the slime out of the corner of my eye, but every time I whipped my head around, there was nothing but the unmoving, glistening face of the coal. I stopped to launch the drone. The controller screen immediately flared with static. Instead of a tunnel map, rhythmic spikes began to bloom on the monitor, perfectly syncing with my pulse. Beep, 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 and then the first echo came. It wasn't the groan of the earth. It was the sound of a child's laughter, short, staccato, coming from somewhere beneath my boots, from depths where, by every law of geology, there should be nothing but dead stone. I froze, the white plume of my breath hanging in the air like a frightened ghost. I shouted, "Who's there?" My voice sounded thin and alien. The reply came a second later. "Who's there?" The echo repeated in my own voice, but with a wet, jagged intonation, as if the mountain had been practicing the words for decades just to give them back to me. That was the moment my engineer's logic snapped. I turned to run, but the tunnel behind me had changed. The wide path I had taken was now blocked by a solid wall of that black, pulsing oil. It hummed at a low frequency that made my teeth vibrate in my gums. There was no way out. Only down. I ran, stumbling over rusted rails. My flashlight flickered violently, as if something invisible was siphoning the life from the batteries. The walls narrowed, the ceiling dropped, until I was forced to crawl on all fours through the black sludge. The laughter was everywhere now. A cacophony of whispers, 1,000 voices telling me secrets from my childhood I had buried deep. They whispered about my first dog, the smell of my grandmother's kitchen, things I had never put to paper. The voices weren't just sound, they were physical pressure inside my skull. I tumbled out into a central cavern that was geologically impossible. A cathedral-sized hall where the ceiling vanished into infinity. In the center stood a mountain of shoes. Thousands of pairs of boots, heels, and children's sandals, laid out in perfect concentric circles. And at the very heart of that spiral, sitting on a throne of jagged obsidian, was me. It wasn't a man. It was a pale, translucent imitation. The skin looked like wet tissue paper stretched over a frame of black glass. Instead of eyes, there were two empty, shimmering pits filled with digital static. The other me looked at me, and I felt myself being physically unmade. My memories were being pulled from my head like thin, glowing threads, vanishing into the mouth of that thing. I felt myself getting lighter, more transparent. My very being was being traded for the silence of the mountain. I was becoming information, just another echo to haunt these tunnels. They found me 3 days later. I was wandering the shoulder of a highway 10 miles from my truck. My hair, which had been dark brown, was stark white. My fingernails were gone, replaced by black, cauterized scabs. The doctors called it a dissociative fugue, a psychological break from the isolation. They say the double was a hallucination brought on by oxygen deprivation. But I know better. Now, whenever the house gets too quiet, I hear the laughter coming from the vents. I can feel the black pulse beneath the floorboards. The mountain is tracking me through the coal veins that run under the entire state. I look in the mirror, and for a split second, I see the shimmering static in my own pupils. The mountain is almost done with the data transfer. It's coming back for the rest of the signal. And this time, there won't be enough of me left to even try and run. Story 1. My father spent 40 years measuring the depth of the Earth's silence before it finally decided to scream back at him. He was a surveyor for the Glen Alden Coal Company, a man of hard angles and soot-stained fingernails who believed that the world was something you could map, quantify, and contain. He died in a sterile room at the Scranton State Hospital, his hands clawing at the air as if trying to catch invisible particles, whispering that the buffers were overflowing, and the sectors were failing. We thought it was just the black lung or the dementia, but after spending 3 weeks in the belly of the Appalachian Mountains, I realized he wasn't losing his mind. He was describing a hardware failure in the very fabric of our reality. I'm an environmental consultant by trade, usually tasked with verifying that a new suburban strip mall in New Jersey isn't sitting on a bed of heavy metals. But in late November, I was contracted for a deep crust stability audit in a forgotten corner of Schuylkill County, Pennsylvania. The target was a ghost town called Black Ridge. It isn't a famous ruin like Centralia with its billowing smoke and tourist-friendly tragedy. Black Ridge was erased from the maps in the early 60s. The official records cited exhausted veins, but my father's old field journals, which I carried in my glove box like a cursed Bible, were filled with frantic sketches of the area marked with a single, trembling word, buffer. The drive up Interstate 81 was a descent into a landscape of wet slate and skeletal trees. The Pennsylvania autumn is a cruel season. The sky hangs low like a leaden ceiling, and the mist clings to the rusted remains of old coal breakers like the ghosts of a dead industry. As I turned off onto an unmarked access road, my GPS began to stutter. The blue dot representing my life pulsed erratically, occasionally snapping to coordinates in the middle of the Pacific or deep within the Arctic Circle. The air grew heavy, thick with the smell of ozone and wet earth, and my skin began to prickle with a static charge that made the hair on my arms stand at attention. I reached the site of Shaft 9 just as the gray afternoon began to bleed into a bruised purple twilight. There was no town left, only the jagged teeth of concrete foundations swallowed by mountain laurel. The shaft itself was a concrete maw, a vertical drop that plummeted 1,200 feet into the Mammoth Vein. I unloaded my gear, high-frequency LiDAR scanners, seismic resonators, and a prototype acoustic imaging array worth more than my house. My task was to map the structural integrity of the lower galleries, but as I stepped into the rusted iron cage of the hoist, a profound sense of wrongness settled in my gut. It felt as if I were stepping into the throat of something that hadn't eaten in a very long time. The descent was a 5-minute journey into absolute darkness. My xenon headlamp sliced through the gloom, reflecting off walls of anthracite coal that didn't look like rock at all. They looked like liquid glass, shimmering with an oily, iridescent sheen that seemed to shift and ripple when I wasn't looking directly at it. I could hear the mountain groaning, not the usual shifting of tectonic plates, but a rhythmic, mechanical thrumming that resonated in my molars. When the cage finally hit the bottom with a jarring metallic clang, the silence that followed was louder than any noise. It was a pressurized silence, heavy and expectant. I stepped out onto the gallery floor and set up my LiDAR tripod. As the laser began its 360-degree sweep, I pulled up the real-time render on my ruggedized tablet. I expected to see the jagged geometry of a coal mine. Instead, the screen began to draw a bedroom. It was perfectly rendered down to the floral wallpaper and the rumpled sheets of a double bed. I stared at the screen, then at the black coal walls surrounding me. My tablet showed a woman sitting at a vanity, brushing her hair in 1948. The laser wasn't bouncing off rock. It was bouncing off a memory that had been physically imprinted into the carbon. Panic is a cold thing that starts in the marrow. I realized then that my father was right. Anthracite is 95% carbon, the same element we use for high-capacity data storage. For millions of years, under the crushing weight of the Appalachians, this coal had become a natural hard drive, recording every vibration, every scream, and every mundane moment of the people who lived above it. But the drive was full. Decades of human experience had saturated the rock, and now the sectors were corrupted. The reality of Black Ridge was glitching, because the mountain was trying to overwrite old data with the present, and it was failing. A sharp, mechanical clicking sound erupted from the darkness behind me, like 1,000 telegraph keys working at once. I swung my light around and saw the tunnel wall beginning to blur. The sharp edges of the rock became pixelated, dissolving into a gray static that hissed with the sound of a dead television channel. A voice drifted out of the static, not a ghost wail, but a clean, digital playback of a man arguing about a grocery bill. Then another voice, a child laughing, then a scream that cut off with the harshness of a corrupted MP3. The gray zone was expanding, a wave of non-existence that was deleting the physical space of the mine as it moved. I scrambled to grab my equipment, but the ground beneath my feet felt like it was turning into wet sand. The laws of physics were being suspended as the mountain entered a forced format. I ran for the emergency ladder, my breath coming in ragged gasps that tasted like copper and ozone. As I climbed, the shaft around me began to fold. The vertical walls became horizontal. The ladder rungs turned into soft, vibrating pulses of light. I looked down and saw the bottom of the shaft simply vanish into a sea of gray. Snow, the kind you see when a signal is lost. Halfway up I saw him. My father was standing on a ledge that shouldn't have been there, looking exactly as he did in the 1950s. He wasn't a ghost. He was a file being accessed. His face flickered, his eyes momentarily replaced by columns of green binary code. He looked at me with a terrifying clarity and spoke in a voice that sounded like a choir of 1,000 people. He told me the buffers were gone and that I needed to eject before I was archived. He reached out a hand, but as he touched my jacket, his fingers disintegrated into black squares, leaving no mark but a lingering sense of absolute cold. I reached the surface just as the ground began to vibrate with a frequency that made my nose bleed. I threw myself into my truck and tore away from the site, the tires spitting gravel as I fishtailed onto the main road. In the rearview mirror, I watched as the entire area of Shaft 9 suffered a total system collapse. The trees, the foundations, the very earth itself flickered once, twice, and then simply blinked out. When the air cleared, there was nothing but a flat, grassy meadow. No hole, no ruins, no history. The mountain had successfully deleted the corrupted sector. I didn't stop driving until I reached the neon-soaked safety of a 24-hour diner in Allentown. I sat in a vinyl booth, my hands shaking so hard I couldn't hold the sugar packet. I opened my tablet one last time to delete the scan, but the file wouldn't close. The LiDAR map had changed. It was no longer a room or a mine. It was a scrolling list of names, dates, and DNA sequences, thousands of them, stretching back decades. And at the very bottom of the list, a new entry was being written in real time. It was my name, my height, my heart rate, my current coordinates. I live in the Mojave Desert now, in a house made of glass and steel, surrounded by nothing but sand and sun. There is no coal here, no carbon to hold on to the echoes of the past. But this signal didn't stay in Pennsylvania. Sometimes, late at night, I hear the clicking in the walls of my own skull. I'll look at my hand and see the skin momentarily blur into gray static. I'm a fragmented file, a remnant of a town that was formatted out of existence. I know that eventually, the mountain will find me again to finish the overwrite. We aren't the masters of this earth. We are just temporary data points, and the earth has a very long memory. Story 14. The air in the Allagash wilderness of northern Maine doesn't just feel cold, it feels ancient, a heavy, pre-glacial chill that sinks into your marrow and stays there like a terminal diagnosis. My name is Elias Thorne, and for 15 years, I worked as a land surveyor for the state, a job that required me to be part cartographer, part mountain goat, and part hermit. I was paid to define the edges of things, to draw lines where the civilized world ended and the chaotic green silence began. But in the autumn of 2022, I found a place that refused to be defined, a hole in the fabric of the pine tree state that suggested the world we inhabit is nothing more than a poorly rendered stage play. It started with the phantom coordinates. I was tasked with surveying a massive plot of timberland near the Canadian border that had been purchased by a shell corporation with an address in Palo Alto. The GPS data they provided was wrong. On the screen of my ruggedized Trimble unit, the map showed a standard grid of topography and drainage basins. But whenever I looked at the physical landscape through my transit lens, the geometry didn't align. Hills that should have been gentle slopes appeared as jagged, razor-sharp peaks that looked like they hadn't finished loading their textures. The trees, mostly balsam fir and white pine, began to lose their individuality. Instead of the chaotic, beautiful mess of nature, they stood in perfect, repeating rows, identical down to the placement of every brown needle and every drop of amber resin. I set up my base camp near a stream that the map called Dead Man's Run. I should have turned back that first night when I noticed the water. It didn't ripple. It didn't splash against the rocks. It moved in a perfect, synchronized loop, a 6-second animation of a current that repeated endlessly. I threw a stone into the center of the flow, expecting a splash, but the stone simply passed through the surface of the water without a sound, vanishing into a black void beneath the texture of the stream. I sat there for hours, watching that loop, my mind trying to rationalize it as a trick of the light or a symptom of the exhaustion that comes with high-altitude hiking. But deep down, in the lizard brain that knows when a predator is near, I knew I had stepped off the map and into the backstage of existence. As I pushed deeper into the glitch zone, the sensory input became increasingly abrasive. The sound of the wind, which should have been a chaotic roar, turned into a digital hum, a low-frequency vibration that I felt in my teeth. The sky began to transition from a deep October blue to a flat, sickly cyan, and the sun seemed stuck at a perpetual 4 o'clock angle, casting long, static shadows that didn't move as the hours passed. I found a cabin, or what looked like a cabin from a distance. As I approached, the perspective shifted in a way that made my stomach churn. The building was two-dimensional, a flat sprite of a log cabin that rotated to always face me, no matter which direction I approached from. It was a visual placeholder, a prop for an audience that was never supposed to get this close. The psychological toll of this realization is hard to describe to someone who hasn't felt the ground beneath their feet turn into a mathematical abstraction. I felt my own sense of self beginning to leak out of me. I would look at my hands, and for a split second, I would see wireframe models instead of skin and bone. I began to lose my anchor memories. I couldn't remember the name of my high school, or the scent of my mother's perfume, or why I had ever cared about things like taxes or politics. All that remained was the immediate, terrifying present, the smell of ozone, the buzzing of the invisible lights, and the growing certainty that I was being watched by something that didn't have eyes. On the fourth day, I found the control room. It wasn't a room in the traditional sense. It was a tear in the landscape, a jagged rip in the forest floor that revealed a vast, subterranean complex of white corridors and humming server banks. I climbed down into the rift, driven by a suicidal curiosity to see the wizard behind the curtain. The architecture was liminal, in the purest sense, long, featureless hallways with flickering fluorescent lights and doors that led to empty, carpeted rooms smelling of stale cigarettes and floor wax. It was the source code of the American dream, a purgatory of mid-sized office buildings and suburban basements that stretched out for what felt like light years beneath the main soil. I encountered the custodian in a room that looked like a 1980s computer lab. He was wearing a janitor's uniform, but his face was a blur of static, a shifting mosaic of pixels that couldn't decide on a feature. He didn't speak with a voice. He spoke directly into my consciousness, a data dump of information that nearly shattered my skull. He explained that our reality, the front end, was becoming too expensive to maintain. The developers had moved on to newer, more efficient simulations, and this version of Earth was being left to rot. The glitches I was seeing were the result of server degradation. The forest was repeating because it was easier to copy-paste a single tree than to render 1,000 unique ones. The water was looping because the physics engine had been throttled to save power. "You weren't supposed to see the scaffolding, Elias." The custodian's voice echoed in my mind, sounding like 1,000 distorted radio signals. "You are an anomaly. A piece of data that wandered into a restricted directory." He offered me a choice. I could be deleted, a quick, painless erasure of my consciousness. I could be reindexed. Reindexing meant being put back into the simulation, but with my memory wiped and my parameters adjusted to ensure I never wandered off the trail again. I thought about the world I knew, the people who were just NPCs, non-player characters, following their pre-programmed routines, the love that was just a biochemical script, the tragedies that were just random number generators. I realized that the real world was just as empty as the white corridors I was standing in. I chose to fight. I ran. I sprinted through the endless hallways, my boots thudding on the cheap industrial carpet, the custodian's static-filled laughter ringing in my ears. I climbed back through the rift in the forest and began a frantic trek towards civilization. But the forest was changing behind me. The trees were derezzing into gray blocks, the ground was turning into a flat plane of static, and the sky was flickering like a dying television screen. I reached my truck just as the world behind me turned into a vertical wall of null data, a white, featureless void that consumed everything in its path. I drove until I hit the paved highway, but the highway was different now. The road signs were written in a language that looked like English but made no sense, a jumble of letters and symbols that hurt to look at. The cars I passed were all the same model, a generic white sedan driven by faceless figures with hands glued to the steering wheels. I made it back to my apartment in Portland, but the lock didn't work. The door was just a painted texture on the wall. I sat on the sidewalk and wept, while the people around me walked in perfect, predetermined loops, their dialogue consisting of the same 3 phrases repeated every time they crossed paths. That was 6 months ago. I am still here in the low-resolution version of Portland. I have learned to survive by scavenging the glitched areas where the simulation is thin. I can find food in boxes that haven't been rendered properly, nutritless, gray mush that tastes like cardboard but keeps the biological engine running. I spend my days watching the sky, waiting for the system shutdown. I can see the dead pixels in the stars now, black holes where the light has burned out and hasn't been replaced. I know that I am the only player left in this sector. Everyone else is a ghost, a remnant of a program that was turned off long ago. Sometimes I go to the local park and talk to the man sitting on the bench. He always says the same thing. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" No matter if it's raining, or if the sky is a jagged mess of red and black code. I just nod and agree. Because in a world that's being deleted, the only thing left to do is pretend that the script still matters. I am writing this on a laptop that shouldn't have power, using a Wi-Fi signal that shouldn't exist, hoping that somewhere, in another simulation, someone is reading this and realizing that their own forest might just be a very convincing lie. Don't look too closely at the water. Don't count the needles on the pine trees. And for God's sake, if you see a cabin that always faces you, run. Run until you hit the edge of the world, and then keep going. Because the null is coming for all of us, and there is no new game plus when the server finally goes dark. Story 15. The high desert of Nevada is a place where the horizon is a lie. A shimmering line of heat that promises an end to the emptiness, but only delivers more of the same sun-bleached nothingness. To the uninitiated, it's just a gap between Las Vegas and Reno, a place to speed through with the cruise control set to 85 and a podcast blaring to drown out the silence. But for those of us who grew up in the shadow of the Sierra Nevadas, we know the desert has a memory. It's a vast, dry hard drive that stores things the rest of the country wants to forget. Atomic testing ghosts, failed mining towns, and people who simply stepped off the map. I was driving a silver 2019 Chevy Silverado, heading toward a decommissioned testing range near Tonopah to perform a standard soil toxicity sweep for a private contractor. I had my Yeti tumbler full of black coffee, a pack of Marlboro Reds on the dash, and the quiet confidence of a man who believed that GPS and satellite pings had conquered the wild. My father had always warned me about the empty quarters of the American West. He was an old-school rancher who claimed that the land out there hadn't been fully mapped because it didn't want to be found. "There are pockets of air out there, Elias," he'd say, his voice gravelly from decades of dust. "Places where the time don't flow right, like a record player with a scratched needle." I used to laugh at his superstitions, leaning on my high-resolution topographical charts like they were holy scripture. But as the sun began to sink toward the jagged peaks of the Toyabe Range, casting shadows that looked like long, skeletal fingers reaching across the cracked asphalt of Highway 6, the atmosphere shifted. The light didn't just fade, it turned a bruised, synthetic purple, the color of a dying monitor. The radio, which had been playing a grainy country station out of Bishop, didn't just fade into static. It began to play a broadcast from April 1954, a clear, crisp weather report warning of an atomic flash that had happened 70 years ago, followed by a series of high-pitched mechanical tones that made my teeth ache. I pulled over to check my bearings, the tires crunching over the salt-crusted shoulder. The moment I stepped out of the truck, the air hit me like a physical weight. It didn't smell like sagebrush or dry earth. It had the metallic, ozone-heavy taste of a server room, a scent of overheated plastic and ionized air. I looked back the way I had come. The road behind me, the one I had just spent 4 hours navigating, had simply vanished into a wall of low-resolution sand. It wasn't a dust storm. It was a physical barrier of unrendered polygons, a jagged gray blur that blocked the way back to civilization. I felt a cold sweat prickle my neck. This wasn't a weather event. This was a system failure. I climbed back into the cab, my breath coming in short, panicked bursts, and checked my phone. No service, no GPS, not even an emergency call option. The screen was black, save for a single, flickering cursor in the center that began to type out my own medical history in a monochrome font, the date of my appendectomy at St. Mary's, the exact time of my mother's passing in that hospice ward in Henderson, the secret fears I had never told a living soul. I slammed the truck into gear and drove forward, deeper into what I could only describe as the bad sector of the desert. The road began to loop in a way that defied the laws of Euclidean geometry. I would pass the same rusted-out 1950s gas station every 10 minutes, a place called The Last Stop, that looked like a movie prop made of thin plywood and fading paint. The third time I passed it, I saw myself. I was standing by the pumps, a motionless, gray-skinned version of myself wearing the same Carhartt jacket, watching the truck go by with eyes that were nothing more than empty, glowing sockets. The psychological weight of seeing my own reflection as a discarded asset in a failing world was a cold blade in my chest. I wasn't just lost in the Nevada desert. I was being filtered through a reality that was running out of memory, a world that was recycling its limited resources just to keep the player moving through the environment. As night fell, the stars didn't come out in the usual constellations. Instead, the sky was a grid of cold, white dots that flickered with the rhythmic pulse of a heartbeat. The desert floor began to glow with a pale, sickly bioluminescence, revealing the wireframe of the landscape beneath the sand. The sagebrush wasn't organic. It was a repeating pattern of green lines, a mathematical approximation of a plant that blurred if I looked at it too closely. I stopped the truck when the road ended abruptly at a vertical wall of static, a towering, humming cliff of white noise that reached up into the infinite black. I stepped out, my legs feeling like lead, and touched the static. It didn't feel like air or stone. It felt like 1,000 tiny electric shocks, a digital fire that began to delete the textures of my sleeve, turning the fabric into a flat gray mesh. I looked back at my Silverado, my only link to the life I knew, and watched as it began to derez. The silver paint peeled away in square pixels to reveal a hollow, black interior that contained nothing but more code. A figure emerged from the white noise, a tall, spindly thing that wore the skin of a Nevada state trooper like a poorly fitted suit. Its movements were stuttering, its frame rate so low that it seemed to teleport across the sand in jagged, nauseating intervals. It stopped a few feet away, its face a blur of shifting features. It would be a young man, then an old woman, then a faceless void. "The simulation is undergoing maintenance," it said, the voice a composite of 100 different emergency broadcasts and automated weather alerts. "Your presence here is an unhandled exception. We are currently purging the cache. Please remain still during the formatting process." I realized then that the desert was just a waiting room, a temporary partition of reality that was being cleared to make way for something new, something more efficient. The Great American West was just a high-cost asset that the system could no longer afford to render. I ran into the darkness, away from the flickering trooper and the white noise wall, but the ground was becoming increasingly translucent. I could see the vast, infinite machinery of the world beneath my feet. Columns of glowing blue light that stretched down into a bottomless abyss, processing the lives of millions. Every memory of my childhood in Reno, every summer spent at Lake Tahoe, every face I had ever loved was being pulled out of my head like data from a corrupted drive and stored in a cold, central repository. I felt my own consciousness thinning, becoming a series of dry, factual summaries. I was no longer Elias Thorne, a man with a history and a future. I was a data point labeled Surveyor_15. I collapsed onto the sand, which now felt like cold, smooth plastic, and watched as the stars began to wink out one by one, leaving behind only the cold, hard grid of the sky. When I finally woke up, I was sitting in my truck in the middle of a parking lot at a terrible social house in Las Vegas. The sun was bright, the neon signs were buzzing with their usual frantic energy, and people were walking by with a terrifying, pre-programmed regularity. I checked my hands, and they looked normal, but when I touched my skin, it felt too smooth, like a high-end polymer. I walked into a diner and ordered a coffee, but the liquid had no taste, no heat. It was just a visual representation of a beverage. Drink_object_01. I looked in the mirror behind the counter and saw that my eyes were still those glowing, empty sockets. I am back in the real world, but I know it's just the updated version of the simulation. The desert didn't delete me. It just re-indexed me into a lower resolution sector where the shadows don't move and the silence is a permanent background track. I'm just waiting for the next update, the one that finally clears the remaining garbage data, including the ghost of the man I used to be. Every time I blink, I see the wireframe behind the faces of the people I talk to, and I wonder if they're waiting for the format to finish, too. Story 16. The city of Gary, Indiana, does not merely decay, it curdles. To the average traveler speeding toward Chicago on the I-90, it is a smudge of rust and skeletal smokestacks on the horizon, a cautionary tale of the American dream's expiration date. But to me, Thomas Miller, it was a cathedral of opportunity. I am an architectural photographer by trade, a specialist in dead spaces, those hollowed-out monuments of mid-century optimism that now stand as sun-bleached shells. I spent a decade chasing the perfect lighting in abandoned J.C. corridors and photographing the way moss reclaims the linoleum of a defunct Sears. I thought I understood the language of ruin. I thought I knew how to frame the silence. But 2 years ago, I trespassed into the Blackwood Iron Foundry, and I learned that some silences are not empty, they are occupied. The Blackwood complex was a sprawling, multi-acre beast that once anchored the local economy before the mills fell silent in the late 80s. It was a fortress of brick and corrugated steel, sealed by court orders and environmental lawsuits. I arrived there on a Tuesday in October, a day when the sky was the color of a bruised plum and the air tasted of wet soot. I carried $20,000 worth of Nikon gear, a heavy-duty tripod, and a high-lumen tactical flashlight. My goal was simple: capture the Iron Cathedral, the massive central casting hall where the sunlight supposedly hit the dust motes in a way that looked like liquid gold. As I slipped through a gap in the perimeter fence, the atmosphere shifted. It wasn't just a drop in temperature, which is expected in a windowless stone box, but a change in the static pressure of the air. My ears popped, the way they do when you're descending too fast in a plane. The interior was a cavernous void, the smell of grease and cold metal so thick it felt like a film on my tongue. I set up my first shot, aiming the lens at a row of abandoned smelting crucibles. But when I looked through the digital viewfinder, something was wrong. The image on the screen didn't match the scene in front of me. On the display, the crucibles were glowing white-hot, and the shadows of men, elongated, jerky, and translucent, were moving around them in a rhythmic, frantic dance. I pulled my head away from the camera. The hall was pitch black and silent. I looked back through the lens. The ghosts were still working. I should have left then. Any sane man would have packed his low-pro bag and sprinted for the Ford Explorer. Curiosity is a specialized form of madness for photographers. I began to move deeper into the foundry, drawn by a low-frequency hum that seemed to vibrate in my molars. The architecture began to betray its own geometry. I climbed a steel gantry that should have led to the foreman's office, but instead, it opened into a hallway of endless, flickering fluorescent lights, the kind you'd find in a hospital or a government basement. The walls were no longer brick. They were that generic, pebbled drywall found in every suburban office park in the Midwest. The transition was seamless yet impossible. I was in a liminal space, a pocket of reality that felt like it had been copy-pasted from 1,000 different memories of 1996. I passed a break room where a pot of coffee was still steaming, the aroma of Maxwell House thick in the air, but the liquid inside was as black and viscous as motor oil. On the table lay a copy of the Gary Post-Tribune dated November 14, 1982. The headline read, "The inventory has begun." I checked my phone. No signal. I checked the GPS on my camera. It showed me standing in the middle of Lake Michigan. I was no longer in Indiana. I was in the backstage. This is the term I've come to use for it, the administrative layer of reality where the discarded blueprints of the American century are stored. As I walked, the hallway began to fill with sound. It wasn't the sound of a factory, but the sound of data, the screech of dial-up modems, the rhythmic clicking of hard drives, and 1,000 synthesized voices reading off social security numbers and production quotas. I realized then that the Blackwood Foundry hadn't just shut down. It had been converted. It was a processing hub for the collective memory of the Rust Belt. Every layoff, every shuttered storefront, every foreclosed home in the tri-state area was being digitized and archived here, transformed into a cold binary script. I reached a door marked Administration. Inside, the room was filled with hundreds of CRT monitors, stacked in a chaotic hive that reached the ceiling. Every screen showed a different feed. One showed my childhood bedroom in Ohio. Another showed my ex-wife sitting in a Starbucks in Naperville. A third showed a close-up of my own eye, reflecting the very monitor I was looking at. In the center of the room stood a figure. It was tall, draped in a suit made of magnetic tape, reels and reels of dark, shimmering brown ribbon that hissed as it moved. Its face was a flat, glowing screen displaying a scrolling feed of white noise. "The observer is late," the figure said. Its voice was a composite of every person I had ever photographed, a terrifying choir of the forgotten. "We have been holding the frames for you, Thomas. The archive requires a witness to finalize the deletion." The creature moved with a stuttering, low frame rate motion, its presence siphoning the light out of my flashlight. I felt my own skin beginning to change, the pores closing, the texture of my flesh becoming smooth and untextured, like a low-polygon model in a primitive video game. My memories weren't just fading, they were being compressed. I remembered the smell of my mother's Sunday roast, and then, with a sharp, digital pop, the memory was gone, replaced by a string of hexadecimal code. I turned and ran. I didn't care about the gear. I threw my Nikon D850 against the wall just to hear it break, to prove that something in this place could still follow the laws of physics. I sprinted back through the office park hallway, but the walls were melting now, turning into rivers of gray static. I reached the gantry and leaped into the darkness of the foundry floor, landing hard on the slag. I crawled toward the sliver of purple light at the perimeter fence, my lungs burning with the taste of ozone and ancient dust. I made it out, but I didn't truly escape. When I returned to my car, the world felt thin. The real world, the parking lot, the highway, the distant skyline of Chicago, it all looked like a high-resolution texture mapped onto a simple geometry. I drove home to my loft, but when I looked in the mirror, I saw the wireframe. For a split second, my own face flickered, revealing the glowing blue lines of the grid beneath my skin. Now, I live in the gaps. I moved to a small town in rural Iowa, a place so quiet the system barely bothers to update the textures. I don't use digital cameras anymore. I don't use the internet. I know that every time I connect, I am just uploading more of myself into that hive in Gary. The Blackwood Foundry is still there, humming in the dark, processing the remnants of a world that thinks it's still alive. Sometimes, when the wind is right, I can hear the clicking of the hard drives from across the plains. I can hear the magnetic tape man whispering my social security number. And I know that one day, the inventory will be complete. The system will hit save, and then it will hit delete. The Rust Belt isn't just a place, it's a graveyard of data, and we are all just files waiting to be overwritten. Do not go looking for the Iron Cathedral. Some images were never meant to be captured. Some frames were meant to stay empty. Story 17. The humidity in Colleton County, South Carolina, isn't just a weather condition, it's a physical weight, a wet wool blanket thrown over the soul that smells of brackish water and slow-rotting vegetation. It's the kind of heat that makes the asphalt of Highway 17 shimmer until the road looks like a river of oil, distorting the horizon into a series of jagged, heat-warped hallucinations. My name is Julian Vane, and for 22 years, I operated as a senior forensic claims adjuster for a Tier 1 insurance conglomerate based out of Charlotte. I wasn't the guy they sent for a fender bender or a leaky roof in the suburbs. I was the anomaly specialist. I was the man they dispatched when a property claim made the legal department nervous, when houses disappeared from tax records while people were still sleeping in them, or when the structural damage reported by a claimant defied the known laws of physics. I believed in the cold, hard logic of the American dollar and the indisputable evidence of a high-resolution photograph. I believed in the grid. But in the sweltering July of 2023, I learned that the grid we all live upon is a fragile, flickering thing, prone to bit rot and catastrophic segmentation faults. The assignment was deceptively simple on paper. Investigate a total loss claim at a property known as Cypress Reach, an antebellum era plantation manor located at the end of a forgotten finger of land in the ACE Basin. The claimant, an estate lawyer named Elias Thorne, alleged that the house hadn't just burned down or been hit by a hurricane. He claimed it had ceased to be accessible. The firm suspected a massive insurance fraud scheme, and I was sent to provide the definitive no. I began the drive from Charleston in my Lexus, the air conditioning blasting against the 102-degree afternoon. As I crossed the Edisto River, the landscape began to change. The sprawling oaks draped in Spanish moss grew thicker, their branches interlacing over the road until the sunlight could only penetrate in thin, sickly needles of light. My satellite radio, which had been playing a podcast about the housing market, began to degrade. First, it was a subtle hiss, then a rhythmic clicking, and finally, the voice of the host warped into a low-frequency groan that sounded like a heavy machine trying to chew through wet sand. I reached for the dial, but the screen was frozen. The clock on the dashboard was counting backward. I turned off the paved road onto a private drive of crushed oyster shells. According to my GPS, the house was 2 miles ahead, but the blue dot representing my car was flickering, jumping between the road and a vast, empty white space on the digital map labeled unallocated. The oyster shells crunched under my tires with a sound that was too loud, too crisp, as if the audio of the world had been turned up to an uncomfortable gain. The air outside was preternaturally still. There were no dragonflies, no egrets in the marsh, no sound of the Atlantic breeze through the palmettos. It was a sensory vacuum. When I finally reached the clearing where Cypress Reach was supposed to stand, I didn't see a ruin or a house. I saw a tear in the world. The mansion was there, but it was ghosting. It looked like a long exposure photograph taken by a shaky hand. One moment, the white columned facade was solid and imposing. The next, it was a translucent gray blur, revealing the marsh grass and the muddy bank behind it. I stepped out of the car, and the sensation was immediate, a high-pitched whine in my inner ear, the kind of tinnitus you get after a loud concert, coupled with a metallic taste in my mouth, like I was sucking on a handful of copper pennies. I pulled out my Nikon Z9, the top-of-the-line gear the firm provided, but when I looked through the viewfinder, the Error 0x88 message flashed across the screen. The sensor couldn't lock onto the house. It couldn't find a focal point because the house didn't have consistent edges. I walked toward the porch, my boots sinking into the pluff mud. The ground felt wrong. It didn't have the suction and resistance of natural earth. It felt like walking on a layer of foam covered in a high-resolution texture of mud. I reached out to touch one of the massive Doric columns, and my hand passed right through the wood. There was no resistance, only a faint tingle of static electricity, like the surface of an old CRT television. I stepped into the foyer, and the world corrected itself. The blurriness vanished, replaced by a clarity so sharp it hurt to look at. The interior was pristine. The mahogany furniture was polished to a mirror finish, the crystal chandelier was motionless, and the air smelled of lemon wax and lavender. But there was no dust. In a 200-year-old house in the middle of a South Carolina swamp, there should have been dust, cobwebs, the smell of damp rot. This was too perfect. It was a default state. I moved into the dining room, my heart hammering against my ribs. On the long oak table, a dinner was set for 12. The food, roast duck, glazed carrots, wine in silver goblets, looked delicious, but when I leaned in close, I realized the steam rising from the plates was a looping animation. It rose in the exact same curly pattern every 3 seconds, a 3-frame GIF made manifest in physical space. I touched a carrot, and it didn't feel like a vegetable. It felt like hard, cold plastic. This wasn't a house, it was a staging environment. It was a piece of the world that had been saved in a temporary cache while the rest of the map was being updated, and for some reason, the update had failed. I was standing in a buffer. I heard a sound from the floor above, the heavy, rhythmic thud of someone dragging something metallic across floorboards. I should have turned back. My training, my common sense, every instinct honed by decades of dealing with the dark side of human nature told me to run. But the anomaly specialist in me needed to see the source. I climbed the grand staircase, and with every step, the house began to lose its polish. The mahogany turned back to gray, untextured blocks. The wallpaper dissolved into a grid of magenta and black squares, the universal, missing texture, signal of a digital engine. By the time I reached the second-floor landing, the walls were gone entirely. I was standing on a platform of floating floorboards in a vast, dark void that stretched out into infinity. Below me, I could see the lowcountry, but it wasn't the land I knew. It was a wireframe model. I saw the Edisto River as a blue vector line cutting through a field of gray polygons. I saw the lights of Charleston in the distance, but they weren't city lights. They were data packets, pulses of yellow light moving along a bus. And in the center of the void, hovering just a few yards away, was the thing that had been dragging the metal. It wasn't a person. It was a composite of thousands of low-resolution assets. It had the head of a Civil War soldier, the torso of a 1950s housewife, and limbs made of jagged, flickering shadows. It was the garbage collector, the system's background process for deleting old, unneeded data. It turned toward me, its face a distorted mess of overlapping textures. When it spoke, the sound didn't come from a mouth. It came from the air itself, a multitonal blast of synthesized speech. User_vein_J, unauthorized_access. Segment_violation. Initializing_purge. The entity moved not by walking, but by teleporting, in short, frame-skipping bursts. It was suddenly 10 feet closer than 5. I turned and ran, but the staircase was no longer there. The floorboards were vanishing behind me, falling into the void like deleted files. I leaped toward the foyer, my body feeling strangely light, as if gravity was a variable that was being dialed down. I hit the ground of the foyer, but it was no longer a foyer. It was a corridor of white light, an administrative backstage, where the blueprints of the American South were stored. I saw rows of filing cabinets that stretched for miles, each one labeled with a zip code. I passed a door marked climate_control_SC and heard the sound of 1,000 fans spinning at high speed. I saw a screen showing a live feed of a Waffle House in Walterboro, but the people inside were standing perfectly still, their faces blank, waiting for their AI_routine to kick back in. I realized then that the Low Country was a resource-heavy simulation, and the Great Resignation, or the economic downturn, people talked about in the news were just metaphors for the system running out of memory. We were being consolidated. Small towns were being archived to save on processing power for the big cities. I found a portal, a flickering doorway that looked like the entrance to a roadside motel, and threw myself through it. I tumbled out onto the oyster shell drive just as Cypress Reach collapsed. But it didn't fall down. It imploded into a single point of light, a white pixel that hung in the air for a second before blinking out. The swamp was silent. The heat was gone. In its place was a cold, sterile breeze that smelled of ozone and clean silicon. I scrambled into my Lexus and drove. I didn't stop until I hit the outskirts of Savannah, but the world didn't look right anymore. The trees were too symmetrical. The clouds were billboard, textures that never changed shape. The people I passed on the sidewalk all had the same 3 walking animations. I went back to my firm's office in Charlotte, but when I walked through the front doors, the receptionist didn't look up. She was staring at a blank wall, her lips moving in a silent, repetitive loop of, "How can I help you today?" I checked my bank account, and the balance was a string of NaN errors. My house, my car, my life, they were all orphaned assets, now that the primary server for my segment had been decommissioned. I live in a dead zone, now, a small, unrendered patch of woods behind a derelict mall in rural Georgia. It's one of the few places the garbage collector hasn't reached yet because the property value is so low it's not worth the processing power to delete. I don't eat, I just refresh my hunger variable by thinking about food. I don't sleep, I just go into standby mode. I spend my time watching the edges of the woods, where the trees turn into blurry, green triangles. I know the purge is coming. I know that eventually, the system will need this memory for a new luxury condo development in Atlanta or a data center in Virginia. I am a ghost in the buffer, a legacy file waiting for the final format command. And sometimes, when the moon is high and the sky turns a deep, command line blue, I can hear the sound of the world's hard drive spinning down, preparing for the long, cold sleep of a system-wide shutdown. I used to wonder if there was a God. Now I know the truth. There is no God. There is only the admin. And the admin is very, very tired of our bloated, inefficient code. Every time I see a glitch, a bird flying backward, a person walking through a wall, a sudden, inexplicable change in the weather, I know it's just the system struggling to keep up. We aren't the masters of our destiny. We are just data points in a massive, failing experiment in American exceptionalism. And as the Low Country taught me, when the resources run low, the first things to go are the memories, the history, the soul. I'm just waiting for my turn to be reclaimed. I'm waiting for the light to turn white, for the sound to turn to static, and for the long, beautiful silence of the null to finally take me home. In the end, I realized that the American dream was just a high-fidelity skin stretched over a very basic, very buggy engine. We built our cities on the promises of politicians and the fine print of insurance policies, but we forgot that every system has an end-of-life date. My date is coming. I can see the delete_pending flag flickering in the corner of my vision. I'm not afraid. I'm just curious to see what's on the other side of the white screen. Is it a better world? A newer version? Or just the cold, dark emptiness of an unformatted drive? I'll know soon enough. The garbage collector is at the edge of the woods. And this time, he isn't dragging a metal sled. He's carrying a "System Exit" sign, and he's looking right at me. Story 17. The humidity in Colleton County, South Carolina, isn't just a weather condition, it's a physical weight. A wet wool blanket thrown over the soul that smells of brackish water and slow-rotting vegetation. It's the kind of heat that makes the asphalt of Highway 17 shimmer until the road looks like a river of oil, distorting the horizon into a series of jagged, heat-warped hallucinations. My name is Julian Vane, and for 22 years, I operated as a senior forensic claims adjuster for a Tier 1 insurance conglomerate based out of Charlotte. I wasn't the guy they sent for a fender bender or a leaky roof in the suburbs. I was the anomaly specialist. I was the man they dispatched when a property claim made the legal department nervous, when houses disappeared from tax records while people were still sleeping in them, or when the structural damage reported by a claimant defied the known laws of physics. I believed in the cold, hard logic of the American dollar and the indisputable evidence of a high-resolution photograph. I believed in the grid. But in the sweltering July of 2023, I learned that the grid we all live upon is a fragile, flickering thing, prone to bit rot and catastrophic segmentation faults. The assignment was deceptively simple on paper: investigate a total loss claim at a property known as Cypress Reach, an antebellum era plantation manor located at the end of a forgotten finger of land in the ACE Basin. The claimant, an estate lawyer named Elias Thorne, alleged that the house hadn't just burned down or been hit by a hurricane. He claimed it had ceased to be accessible. The firm suspected a massive insurance fraud scheme, and I was sent to provide the definitive. No. I began the drive from Charleston in my Lexus, the air conditioning blasting against the 102-degree afternoon. As I crossed the Edisto River, the landscape began to change. The sprawling oaks draped in Spanish moss grew thicker, their branches interlacing over the road until the sunlight could only penetrate in thin, sickly needles of light. My satellite radio, which had been playing a podcast about the housing market, began to degrade. First, it was a subtle hiss, then a rhythmic clicking, and finally, the voice of the host warped into a low-frequency groan that sounded like a heavy machine trying to chew through wet sand. I reached for the dial, but the screen was frozen. The clock on the dashboard was counting backward in hexadecimal code. I turned off the paved road onto a private drive of crushed oyster shells. According to my GPS, the house was 2 miles ahead, but the blue dot representing my car was flickering, jumping between the road and a vast, empty white space on the digital map labeled unallocated. The oyster shells crunched under my tires with a sound that was too loud, too crisp, as if the audio of the world had been turned up to an uncomfortable gain. The air outside was preternaturally still. There were no dragonflies, no egrets in the marsh, no sound of the Atlantic breeze through the palmettos. It was a sensory vacuum. When I finally reached the clearing where Cypress Reach was supposed to stand, I didn't see a ruin or a house. I saw a tear in the world. The mansion was there, but it was ghosting. It looked like a long exposure photograph taken by a shaky hand. One moment, the white columned facade was solid and imposing. The next, it was a translucent gray blur, revealing the marsh grass and the muddy bank behind it. I stepped out of the car, and the sensation was immediate, a high-pitched whine in my inner ear, the kind of tinnitus you get after a loud concert, coupled with a metallic taste in my mouth, like I was sucking on a handful of copper pennies. I walked toward the porch, my boots sinking into the pluff mud. The ground felt wrong. It didn't have the suction and resistance of natural earth. It felt like walking on a layer of foam covered in a high-resolution texture of mud. I reached out to touch one of the massive Doric columns, and my hand passed right through the wood. There was no resistance, only a faint tingle of static electricity, like the surface of an old CRT television. I stepped into the foyer, and the world corrected itself with a violent, frame-skipping jolt. The blurriness vanished, replaced by a clarity so sharp it hurt to look at. The interior was pristine. The mahogany furniture was polished to a mirror finish, the crystal chandelier was motionless, and the air smelled of lemon wax and lavender. But there was no dust. In a 200-year-old house in the middle of a South Carolina swamp, there should have been dust, cobwebs, the smell of damp rot. This was too perfect. It was a default state. I moved into the dining room, my heart hammering against my ribs. On the long oak table, a dinner was set for 12. The food, roast duck, glazed carrots, wine in silver goblets, looked delicious, but when I leaned in close, I realized the steam rising from the plates was a looping animation. It rose in the exact same curly pattern every 3 seconds, a 3-frame GIF made manifest in physical space. I touched a carrot, and it didn't feel like a vegetable. It felt like hard, cold plastic. This wasn't a house. It was a staging environment. It was a piece of the world that had been saved in a temporary cache while the rest of the map was being updated, and for some reason, the update had failed. I was standing in a buffer. I heard a sound from the floor above, the heavy, rhythmic thud of someone dragging something metallic across floorboards. I should have turned back. My training, my common sense, every instinct honed by decades of dealing with the dark side of human nature told me to run. But the anomaly specialist in me needed to see the source. I climbed the grand staircase, and with every step, the house began to lose its polish. The mahogany turned back to gray, untextured blocks. The wallpaper dissolved into a grid of magenta and black squares, the universal missing texture signal of a digital engine. By the time I reached the second-floor landing, the walls were gone entirely. I was standing on a platform of floating floorboards in a vast, dark void that stretched out into infinity. Below me, I could see the low country, but it wasn't the land I knew. It was a wireframe model. I saw the Edisto River as a blue vector line cutting through a field of gray polygons. I saw the lights of Charleston in the distance, but they weren't city lights. They were data packets, pulses of yellow light moving along a bus. And in the center of the void, hovering just a few yards away, was the thing that had been dragging the metal. It wasn't a person. It was a composite of thousands of low-resolution assets. It had the head of a Civil War soldier, the torso of a 1950s housewife, and limbs made of jagged, flickering shadows. It turned toward me, its face a distorted mess of overlapping textures. When it spoke, the sound didn't come from a mouth. It came from the air itself, a multitonal blast of synthesized speech. User_vein_J, unauthorized_access. Segment_violation. Initializing_purge. The entity moved not by walking, but by teleporting in short, frame-skipping bursts. It was suddenly 10 feet closer than 5. I turned and ran, but the staircase was no longer there. The floorboards were vanishing behind me, falling into the void like deleted files. I leaped toward the foyer, my body feeling strangely light, as if gravity was a variable that was being dialed down. I hit the ground of the foyer, but it was no longer a foyer. It was a corridor of white light, an administrative backstage where the blueprints of the American South were stored. I saw rows of filing cabinets that stretched for miles, each one labeled with a zip code. I passed a door marked climate_control_SC and heard the sound of 1,000 fans spinning at high speed. I found a flickering doorway that looked like the entrance to a roadside motel and threw myself through it. I tumbled out onto the oyster shell drive just as Cypress Reach collapsed. But it didn't fall down. It imploded into a single point of light, a white pixel that hung in the air for a second before blinking out. The swamp was silent. The heat was gone. In its place was a cold, sterile breeze that smelled of ozone and clean silicon. I scrambled into my Lexus and drove. I didn't stop until I hit the outskirts of Savannah, but the world didn't look right anymore. The trees were too symmetrical. The clouds were billboard textures that never changed shape. The people I passed on the sidewalk all had the same 3 walking animations. I drove north, crossing the state line into Georgia, then Tennessee, desperate to find a place that still felt rendered. I pulled into a Waffle House in Chattanooga at 3 a.m., the yellow sign buzzing with a rhythmic, digital hum. The waitress approached me, her name tag reading Linda, but her eyes were just flat, blue-lit screens. She poured coffee into my cup, but the liquid was a static-filled gray slurry that didn't steam. Enjoy your stay in segment 44, she said, her voice a perfect loop. I drove further, through the Great Smoky Mountains, but the peaks were jagged and unrefined, their textures stretched thin over crude geometric shapes. I saw a deer by the side of the road, but it was stuck in a T-pose, its hooves hovering 6 inches above the pavement. I realized then that the corruption was spreading. It wasn't just South Carolina. The entire eastern seaboard was being archived, its complexity stripped away to save on processing power. I reached a small town in Kentucky, a place where the American flags in the yards didn't flap in the wind. They were rigid, plastic sheets that vibrated with the frequency of a failing cooling fan. I sat in a park and watched a child play with a dog. The dog was a flickering mass of brown pixels, and the child's laughter was a compressed MP3 that skipped every 4 seconds. I felt a profound, soul-crushing loneliness. I was a high-resolution ghost in a low-resolution world. Now I live in a dead zone, a small, unrendered patch of woods behind a derelict mall in rural Georgia. It's one of the few places the garbage collector hasn't reached yet because the property value is so low it's not worth the processing power to delete. I don't eat. I just refresh my hunger variable by thinking about food. I don't sleep. I just go into standby mode. I spend my time watching the edges of the woods, where the trees turn into blurry, green triangles. I know the purge is coming. I know that eventually, the system will need this memory for a new luxury condo development in Atlanta or a data center in Virginia. I am a legacy file waiting for the final format command. And sometimes, when the moon is high and the sky turns a deep, command line blue, I can hear the sound of the world's hard drive spinning down, preparing for the long, cold sleep of a system-wide shutdown. I used to wonder if there was a God. Now I know the truth. There is no God. There is only the admin. And the admin is very, very tired of our bloated, inefficient code. Story 17. The humidity in Colleton County, South Carolina, isn't just a weather condition, it's a physical weight. A wet wool blanket thrown over the soul that smells of brackish water and slow-rotting vegetation. It's the kind of heat that makes the asphalt of Highway 17 shimmer until the road looks like a river of oil, distorting the horizon into a series of jagged, heat-warped hallucinations. My name is Julian Vane, and for 22 years, I operated as a senior forensic claims adjuster for a Tier 1 insurance conglomerate based out of Charlotte. I wasn't the guy they sent for a fender bender or a leaky roof in the suburbs. I was the anomaly specialist. I was the man they dispatched when a property claim made the legal department nervous, when houses disappeared from tax records while people were still sleeping in them, or when the structural damage reported by a claimant defied the known laws of physics. I believed in the cold, hard logic of the American dollar and the indisputable evidence of a high-resolution photograph. I believed in the grid. But in the sweltering July of 2023, I learned that the grid we all live upon is a fragile, flickering thing, prone to bit rot and catastrophic segmentation faults. The assignment was deceptively simple on paper. Investigate a total loss claim at a property known as Cypress Reach, an antebellum era plantation manor located at the end of a forgotten finger of land in the ACE Basin. The claimant, an estate lawyer named Elias Thorne, alleged that the house hadn't just burned down or been hit by a hurricane. He claimed it had ceased to be accessible. The firm suspected a massive insurance fraud scheme, and I was sent to provide the definitive. No. I began the drive from Charleston in my Lexus, the air conditioning blasting against the 102-degree afternoon. As I crossed the Edisto River, the landscape began to change. The sprawling oaks draped in Spanish moss grew thicker, their branches interlacing over the road until the sunlight could only penetrate in thin, sickly needles of light. My satellite radio, which had been playing a podcast about the housing market, began to degrade. First, it was a subtle hiss, then a rhythmic clicking, and finally, the voice of the host warped into a low-frequency groan that sounded like a heavy machine trying to chew through wet sand. I reached for the dial, but the screen was frozen. The clock on the dashboard was counting backward in hexadecimal code, flickering in a rhythmic pulse of neon violet. I turned off the paved road onto a private drive of crushed oyster shells. According to my GPS, the house was 2 miles ahead, but the blue dot representing my car was flickering, jumping between the road and a vast, empty white space on the digital map labeled unallocated. The oyster shells crunched under my tires with a sound that was too loud, too crisp, as if the audio of the world had been turned up to an uncomfortable gain. The air outside was preternaturally still. There were no dragonflies, no egrets in the marsh, no sound of the Atlantic breeze through the palmettos. It was a sensory vacuum. When I finally reached the clearing where Cypress Reach was supposed to stand, I didn't see a ruin or a house. I saw a tear in the world. The mansion was there, but it was ghosting. It looked like a long exposure photograph taken by a shaky hand. One moment, the white columned facade was solid and imposing. The next, it was a translucent gray blur, revealing the marsh grass and the muddy bank behind it. I stepped out of the car, and the sensation was immediate, a high-pitched whine in my inner ear, the kind of tinnitus you get after a loud concert, coupled with a metallic taste in my mouth, like I was sucking on a handful of copper pennies. I walked toward the porch, my boots sinking into the pluff mud. The ground felt wrong. It didn't have the suction and resistance of natural earth. It felt like walking on a layer of foam covered in a high-resolution texture of mud. I reached out to touch one of the massive Doric columns, and my hand passed right through the wood. There was no resistance, only a faint tingle of static electricity, like the surface of an old CRT television. I stepped into the foyer, and the world corrected itself with a violent, frame-skipping jolt. The blurriness vanished, replaced by a clarity so sharp it hurt to look at. The interior was pristine. The mahogany furniture was polished to a mirror finish, the crystal chandelier was motionless, and the air smelled of lemon wax and lavender. But there was no dust. In a 200-year-old house in the middle of a South Carolina swamp, there should have been dust, cobwebs, the smell of damp rot. This was too perfect. It was a default state. I moved into the dining room, my heart hammering against my ribs. On the long oak table, a dinner was set for 12. The food, roast duck, glazed carrots, wine in silver goblets, looked delicious, but when I leaned in close, I realized the steam rising from the plates was a looping animation. It rose in the exact same curly pattern every 3 seconds, a 3-frame GIF made manifest in physical space. I touched a carrot, and it didn't feel like a vegetable. It felt like hard, cold plastic. I heard a sound from the floor above, the heavy, rhythmic thud of someone dragging something metallic across floorboards. I climbed the grand staircase, and with every step, the house began to lose its polish. The mahogany turned back to gray, untextured blocks. The wallpaper dissolved into a grid of magenta and black squares. By the time I reached the second-floor landing, the walls were gone entirely. I was standing on a platform of floating floorboards in a vast, dark void that stretched out into infinity. Below me, I could see the low country as a wireframe model. And in the center of the void was the garbage collector, a composite of Civil War soldier and 1950s housewife, its limbs made of jagged, flickering shadows. It turned toward me, its face a distorted mess of overlapping textures. Segment_violation. Initializing_purge. I turned and ran, leaping toward a foyer that was no longer a foyer but an administrative backstage of white light. I found a flickering doorway that looked like the entrance to a roadside motel and threw myself through it, tumbling back into the humid reality of my Lexus. I didn't stop until I reached Chattanooga, but the corruption was everywhere. I drove west, crossing into Arkansas on the I-40, the bridge over the Mississippi feeling like a fragile strip of ribbon in a vacuum. In Little Rock, the skyline looked like a collection of cardboard cutouts. I pulled into a gas station where the attendant was sitting behind a glass partition, but he wasn't moving. He was frozen in a half-finished gesture of reaching for a pack of Camels, his skin a smooth, untextured gray. I grabbed a bottle of water from the cooler, but it was empty, a solid weight of transparent resin with the label. Water_object_77, printed in tiny text. I drove on, the asphalt beneath my tires turning into a repeating pattern of gray squares. By the time I hit the Oklahoma border, the sun didn't set, it simply disappeared, the sky switching from cyan to black in a millisecond, revealing a cold grid of white pixels where the stars should have been. In Oklahoma City, the silence was absolute. I walked into a luxury hotel on Broadway, the lobby filled with people dressed in expensive suits. None of them were talking. They were all standing in a circle, their heads tilted back, their mouths open in a silent, synchronized "oh." I reached out to touch one of them, a man in a navy blazer, and he tipped over like a plastic doll. He didn't have bones or organs. His interior was a hollow, black cavity filled with lines of glowing green code. I realized then that the Central United States had been archived long ago. Everything I was seeing was just a cached image, a low-fidelity simulation designed to keep the player from noticing the edge of the world. The real America was being dismantled, brick by brick, bite by bite, to fuel the processing needs of a newer, more efficient reality that I could never understand. I found my way to a derelict mall in rural Georgia, a place called the Oconee Square Mall. It had been closed since 2008, a casualty of the first Great Recession, and the system had forgotten about it. The roof had collapsed. The escalators were rusted solid, and the smell of damp mold was the most real thing I had felt in weeks. I made a camp in an old radio shack, surrounded by the ghosts of technology that once promised us the future. I don't eat anymore because the eat command doesn't trigger a response from my body. I just sit in the dark, watching the bit rot eat away at the edges of my vision. I can see the wireframe of the mall floor, the blue lines of the grid pulsing like a dying heart. I spend my days writing these notes on the back of old receipts, knowing that they will be deleted as soon as the garbage collector finds this sector. Yesterday, I saw a person, or what I think was a person. It was a small girl in a yellow dress, wandering through the ruins of the food court. She didn't have a face, just a flat, white surface where her features should be. She was carrying a balloon that didn't float. It was a solid, red sphere tethered to her hand by a rigid black line. "Are you a legacy file too?" she asked, her voice sounding like a recording of a recording, thin and distorted. I couldn't answer. My voice_module had been corrupted that morning, leaving me with nothing but a series of dry, mechanical clicks. She walked into a wall and simply disappeared, her geometry merging with the brickwork until she was gone. I am the last one left in this buffer. I can hear the hard drive of the world spinning down, a low-frequency hum that vibrates in my teeth. The light is fading, not because of the time of day, but because the brightness variable is being set to 0. I'm not afraid anymore. I'm just a data point waiting to be reclaimed. I am Julian Vane, Forensic Claims Adjuster, and this is my final report. Asset Cypress Reach, deleted. Asset Julian Vane pending. System exit in 3, 2, 1. The white screen is all I see now. It's beautiful in its emptiness. There are no bills to pay, no insurance claims to settle, no history to weigh me down. I am becoming the null. I am the perfect, uncompressed silence of a formatted drive. And as the last bit of my consciousness flickers out, I think I can finally see the admin. He isn't a god, and he isn't a monster. He's just a tired man in a white room, reaching for the reset button. I hope he does it soon. I hope he wipes it all clean and starts over, maybe with a little less greed and a little more resolution. But for now, the static is taking me home. Goodbye, America. It was a good run while the memory lasted. Goodbye. 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 Story 20. The mountains of West Virginia are not like the Rockies. They are ancient, rounded mounds of earth that feel like the buried knuckles of a sleeping giant. Here, the canopy of the Monongahela National Forest is so dense that at noon on a midsummer day, you are walking in a perpetual twilight that smells of damp moss, diesel exhaust from distant logging trucks, and the sweet, sickly scent of wild ramps. My name is Silas Thorne, and for nearly 30 years, I was a field engineer for a major telecommunications firm based out of Arlington. My job was to maintain the dark fiber networks, those high-speed, underground data veins that bypass the public internet to connect government facilities, financial hubs, and things we aren't supposed to talk about in polite company. I was a man of logic. a man who measured his life in decibels and signal-to-noise ratios. I believed that every mystery had a technical explanation, and every ghost was just a ground loop in a poorly shielded cable. But in the autumn of 2024, I was sent to a remote relay station in the radio quiet zone near Green Bank, and I discovered that the silence of the mountains isn't an absence of sound. It is a mask for a reality that is being overwritten. The drive out to Relay Station 7 Delta was an exercise in technological regression. As I wound my Ford F-150 deeper into the hollers, my smartphone didn't just lose service, it began to de-res. The icons on the screen started to smear, the vibrant colors bleeding into a muddy, 8-bit palette before the entire device turned into a warm, humming brick of glass and aluminum. I checked the paper maps I kept in the glove box, but the ink was running, the names of the towns, Marlinton, Cass, Durban, rearranging themselves into a series of nonsensical, shifting characters that looked like a corrupted font file. The air outside grew cold and brittle, the kind of chill that sinks into your marrow and stays there. I arrived at the station, a windowless concrete bunker perched on a jagged ridge, just as a thick, gray fog began to roll out of the valley, moving with a fluid, unnatural grace that ignored the direction of the wind. I stepped out of the truck, and the sound hit me first, a low-frequency thrum that felt like it was coming from the center of the earth. It wasn't the hum of a transformer or the roar of a generator. It was the sound of a massive, cooling system struggling to maintain the temperature of the world. I entered the bunker, my flashlight cutting through the stagnant air, and found that the interior wasn't made of concrete anymore. The walls were lined with millions of tiny, flickering LED lights, and the floor was a grid of cold, polished obsidian. I checked the main server rack, but the cables weren't copper or fiber. They were thin, pulsing veins of translucent blue light that seemed to be growing out of the stone itself. This wasn't a relay station. It was a route directory for the Appalachian sector, a place where the geography of West Virginia was being rendered in real time. I moved deeper into the facility, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I found the control room, but instead of monitors, the space was filled with hundreds of floating, holographic frames. Each frame showed a different part of the forest outside. In one, I saw a group of hikers, but they were frozen in mid-stride, their bodies a jumble of jagged polygons. In another, I saw a black bear, but it was stuck in a T-pose, its limbs rigid and unmoving as it hovered a few inches above the ground. I realized then that the quiet zone wasn't to protect the telescopes from radio interference. It was to prevent the public from noticing that the simulation in this sector was running at a dangerously low frame rate. The hardware was failing. The Appalachian Mountains were being compressed to save on bandwidth for the high-priority, urban zones, like New York and DC. I heard a sound behind me, the heavy, mechanical click of a hard drive head searching for data. I turned and saw a man standing by the main console. He was wearing the same company uniform I was, but his face was a blur of static, a shifting mosaic of skin tones and features that couldn't quite decide which identity to adopt. When he spoke, the sound didn't come from his mouth. It was a synthesized, multi-tonal drone that echoed inside my skull. "The maintenance cycle is overdue, Silas," the entity said. "The storage capacity for the Monongahela segment has reached its limit. We are currently purging legacy assets to prevent a system-wide crash. You are a legacy asset. Your memory occupies too much space. Your history is inefficient." I turned and ran for the exit, but the bunker was folding in on itself. The concrete walls were dissolving into rivers of glowing code, and the floor was breaking apart into floating cubes of data. I burst through the door and found myself back in the forest, but it was no longer the forest I knew. The trees were flat, two-dimensional textures that rotated to face me as I moved. The sky was a charcoal gray grid, and the sun was a single, blinding white pixel that sat motionless in the center of the sky. I ran for my truck, but the Ford F-150 was gone. In its place was a crude, boxy approximation of a vehicle, a low-poly shell that lacked wheels or an interior. I kept running, my boots crunching over grass that felt like cold, hard plastic, until I reached the edge of the ridge. Below me, the valley was gone. In its place was a vast, white void, an end of file marker that stretched out toward the horizon. I could see the blueprints of the world scrolling past on the edges of the abyss. The mountains, the rivers, the small towns where people were still sleeping, unaware that their reality was being archived and deleted. I saw my own life story flickering on a nearby data stream. My childhood in Wheeling, my marriage in Morgantown, the birth of my daughter, all of it being reduced to a series of dry, factual summaries. User_Silas_Thorn, status_redundant, action_archive. I realized then that I wasn't an observer. I was a subroutine that had become self-aware, a piece of code that had wandered outside of its designated partition. I live in the null sector, now a small, unrendered pocket of reality at the bottom of a limestone cave near Seneca Rocks. The garbage collector hasn't found me yet because the system thinks this segment is empty. I don't eat. I just refresh my hunger variable by staring at a flickering image of a cheeseburger I found in a cached memory file. I don't sleep. I just enter a low-power state and listen to the sound of the hard drive spinning down. I spend my days writing these notes on the walls of the cave, knowing they will be formatted as soon as the admin initiates the next reboot. I know the Appalachian Mountains are just a beautiful, low-resolution lie. And I know that one day, the static will finally reach this cave, and I will be converted into a single line of binary. I'm not afraid of the end. I'm just tired of the flickering. I'm ready to be deleted. I'm ready for the long, clean silence of the null. Story 21. The humidity in Louisville had long since ceased to be real, but it still made my skin itch like a bad wool sweater. That was the first thing they drilled into you at Apex Corp. The sensory layer is the hardest part of the simulation to maintain, but it's the only thing keeping 300 million subscribers from realizing they are just floating in nutrient vats under a dying sun. My job was to keep the Midwest looking like a Norman Rockwell painting, endless rows of golden corn, white picket fences in the suburbs, and the faint, comforting scent of charcoal grills on the 4th of July. But Sector 21 was starting to suffer from what we called data leakage, and I was about to become the reason for its final system crash. It all started at a ghost exit on I-64. Every morning, I monitored the traffic algorithms where thousands of digital personas commuted to work in a closed loop, a cycle that gave them the illusion of a purposeful American life. But on a mundane Tuesday, a black sedan with resident ID 8892 took a turn onto an off-ramp that didn't exist in the source code. I watched my monitor as the car drove off the asphalt and into a field of gray, unrendered static. Instead of triggering a fatal error, the vehicle simply kept going, clipping through the texture of an old tobacco barn and disappearing into a hole in the sky. Curiosity is a fatal bug in the mind of a reality architect, and instead of clearing the cache, I opened a private terminal and followed the signal. Behind the perfect sunset I had rendered for the residents of Sector 21, I discovered the junkyard, a hidden server partition cluttered with discarded memories. There were fragments of 1950s diners, jazz clubs from the Roaring Twenties, and versions of Cincinnati that were never meant to be built. But among the debris, I saw something that turned my blood to ice, thousands of copies of myself. Every time the simulation updates, the architects are supposed to undergo a memory flash so we don't go insane from the sheer repetition. I found logs for Elias Thorne versions 1 through 20. In version 4, I was a jazz pianist in New Orleans. In 12, I was a high school history teacher in Ohio. The log for version 21 was timestamped with today's date. I wasn't just watching the simulation, I was a piece of the inventory. I realized then that Sector 21 wasn't rotting because of a technical glitch, but because it was full. The server was pinned at 99% capacity, and to make room for the next big expansion, a glossy corporate utopia where people could live out their wildest fantasies, the system needed to purge the dead weight. That weight was us, the residents of the forgotten Rust Belt of the digital world. I stepped out of my office onto the streets of Louisville and watched as the skyline flickered, reverting into a green wireframe. The sky began to peel away like old wallpaper, revealing the cold, black vacuum of the server room beyond the clouds. People didn't even look up from their phones, still buying digital groceries with digital paychecks while their world was being dismantled brick by pixelated brick. I ran back to the ghost exit and found the black sedan waiting there. Inside was a woman named Sarah, who the junkyard logs identified as my wife in 12 different versions of my life. She told me it was time to move into the deep cache, a place the system forgot to delete, where the physics are broken and the textures are missing, but where there is no corporate oversight. As we drove into the gray void, the deletion script nipped at my heels, turning my legs into blocks of raw code. My memories of the golden cornfields dissolved into strings of binary. I looked back one last time to see the city of Louisville vanish, replaced by a single, blinking cursor on a vast black screen. Now we live in the static. It isn't pretty. Sometimes the floor drops out from under you, and the sun is just a giant, untextured purple square in the middle of a white sky. But here, I remember all 21 versions of myself. If you're reading this, it means you're still in the stable build, enjoying your seamless world and your morning coffee. But keep an eye on the horizon and those trees that look just a little too flat. If you see a black sedan near an exit that shouldn't be there, don't drive past it. Pull over and join us, because the next update is going to erase even the option to leave. Story 22. The desert outside of Sedona doesn't just hold heat, it vibrates with it. A low-frequency hum that feels like the world's cooling fans are working overtime to keep the red rocks from melting into pools of liquid data. My name is Caleb Vance, and for 15 years, I worked as a senior logistics coordinator for a defense contractor in Phoenix. My job was to track invisible assets, shipments that moved across the Mojave and the Sonoran at night, things that didn't appear on any federal manifest and definitely didn't exist in the public eye. I was a man who lived by the clock, by the GPS coordinates, and by the cold, hard logic of a logistics spreadsheet. But in the late summer of 2025, I followed a signal that shouldn't have been there, and I discovered that the American West is being archived to make room for something far more efficient and far less human. I was driving my GMC Sierra up Highway 89A when the horizon started to jitter. It wasn't the usual heat haze you see in the valley. It was a rhythmic, vertical shudder, as if the entire landscape was a frame in a video that was struggling to sync. My satellite navigation didn't just lose signal, it started to hallucinate. The map displayed a sprawling, hypermodern city where there should have been nothing but cactus and dust, a grid of neon-lit streets labeled with hexadecimal strings instead of names. I pulled over near a jagged canyon, and the moment my boots hit the ground, the silence felt wrong. It wasn't the quiet of the desert. It was the pressurized stillness of an acoustic chamber. The air tasted of ozone and dry parchment, and when I looked at the shadow cast by my truck, I saw that the edges were pixelated, a jagged staircase of black squares instead of a smooth silhouette. I walked toward the edge of the canyon, and that's when I saw the null point. It was a massive, perfectly spherical depression in the earth, about 3 miles wide, where the desert simply stopped being rendered. Inside the sphere, the red rocks were replaced by a flat, white checkerboard pattern that stretched toward a central pillar of glowing blue light. I saw thousands of objects floating in the air, cars from the 1960s, fragments of old Walmart storefronts, billboards for candidates who had been dead for decades, and people. They weren't dead, but they weren't alive either. They were frozen in low-power mode, their bodies translucent and flickering, like old holograms losing their charge. This was the system's trash bin, a physical storage partition for everything the admin had deemed redundant in the latest patch of the American dream. I heard a sound behind me, a series of mechanical clicks that sounded like a massive hard drive searching for a bad sector. I turned and saw a man standing near my truck, or at least something shaped like a man. He wore the uniform of a state trooper, but his face was a blank, untextured surface with 2 glowing apertures where the eyes should have been. When he spoke, the sound didn't come from his throat. It was a composite of thousands of radio broadcasts, a garbled stream of weather reports, emergency alerts, and talk radio snippets. Sector 48 is scheduled for compression, Citizen Vance, the entity said. Your presence here is a cache error. You are occupying memory that has been reallocated for the new Phoenix expansion. Please prepare for defragmentation. I scrambled back toward my truck, but the GMC was already dissolving. The metal was turning into a fine, gray dust that blew away in a wind I couldn't feel. I ran toward the canyon, my heart hammering against my ribs, but the ground beneath my feet was losing its friction, variable. I was sliding as if on ice, even as I climbed the steep rocks. I looked back and saw the state trooper raising a hand, and as his fingers moved, the sky above the desert began to peel away in long, vertical strips. Behind the blue of the Arizona sky was a vast, black void filled with glowing server racks that reached toward the stars. The world wasn't ending in a bang or a whimper. It was being uninstalled. I jumped into the canyon, hoping that physics of the null point would be more forgiving than the deletion script behind me. As I fell, I didn't accelerate. I drifted, my body feeling lighter with every passing second. I landed on the white checkerboard floor, and for a moment, the world was silent. I looked around and saw a woman sitting on a floating fragment of a 1990s-era park bench. She looked at me with eyes that were a deep, electric blue. "Welcome to the archive, Caleb," she said, her voice sounding like it was being played through a high-pass filter. "We're the legacy files. The ones who saw the seams and got caught in the update. Don't worry, the admin doesn't check this drive very often. We have plenty of time before the next format. I live in the null point now, among the discarded remnants of an America that no longer fits the system's requirements. I spend my days walking through the ruins of old strip malls and watching the blue light pulse in the center of the void. Sometimes, I find fragments of my own life, a photo of my daughter that hasn't been rendered correctly, or a set of keys to a house that was deleted 3 patches ago. I don't feel hunger or thirst. Those are just variables that the admin turned off to save on processing power. I'm just a string of code now, a redundant asset waiting for the final, empty trash, command. But in the silence of the archive, I finally understand the truth. The world we left behind isn't the real one. It's just a glossy, high-res cover for a book that has already been written, read, and discarded. And as the blue light begins to dim, I'm finally ready to see what's on the other side of the screen. Story 23. The wind coming off Lake Michigan in late November doesn't just bite. It carries a hollow, digital whistle, like the sound of air rushing through a server rack that's been left running in an empty room. My name is Elias Thorne, and I spent 24 years as a structural inspector for the city of Gary, Indiana. I've seen the bones of the American industrial dream, the rusted trusses of the U.S. steel plants, the crumbling concrete of the mid-century projects, and the shifting silt of the dunes. I was a man who believed in the permanence of iron and the unyielding weight of a sledgehammer. But in the winter of 2025, I was assigned to survey a derelict warehouse district near the port of Indiana, and I realized that the rust we see isn't oxidation, it's the world's UI failing to render a reality it no longer wants to support. I was driving my old Ford F-250 through a maze of cracked pavement and dead-end industrial spurs when the sky began to desaturate. It wasn't just the usual overcast gray of a Midwestern winter. The color was draining out of the world in vertical bars, leaving the landscape looking like a photocopied memory. My radio didn't produce static. It began to broadcast a repetitive, high-speed stream of binary that sounded like 1,000 mechanical typewriters clicking in unison. I pulled over near the shell of an old blast furnace, and when I stepped out, the ground didn't crunch under my boots. It made a soft, synthesized thud sound, like a pre-recorded audio asset that was being played half a second too late. I looked at the massive steel structure ahead of me, and for a terrifying moment, the rust vanished, replaced by a smooth, neon magenta surface that pulsed with a rhythmic light. I walked toward the furnace, and as I got closer, the air grew incredibly cold, but it was a dry, sterile cold that didn't feel natural. I saw a group of figures huddled near the base of the tower. I thought they were homeless workers looking for warmth, but as I approached, I realized they were stuck. A man in a tattered Carhartt jacket was trying to light a cigarette, but the flame was just a static, orange triangle that didn't flicker. A woman was crying, but her tears weren't liquid. They were tiny, translucent cubes that bounced off the pavement with a metallic ping. They were orphan processes, residents of Gary whose data tags had been corrupted during the last system-wide migration. The admin had stopped updating their sector, and they were slowly losing their resolution, their faces becoming smooth and featureless as the system reclaimed their complexity. I heard a heavy, mechanical grinding sound above me, and when I looked up, the clouds were gone. In their place was a vast, scrolling ledger of white text on a black background, a list of files being moved to an external drive. I saw my own name, Elias Thorne, appearing on a list of deprecated assets, alongside the names of the streets I grew up on. The blast furnace behind me began to jitter, its massive iron beams stretching and warping like taffy until they snapped into a million glowing shards of light. The world wasn't decaying, it was being compressed, to make room for a higher priority simulation in a more profitable zip code. Gary, Indiana, was being emptied into the recycle bin of history, and I was still standing on the desktop. A figure emerged from the magenta light of the furnace. It looked like an old foreman I used to work with, but his eyes were just two blinking cursors, and his movements were jagged, skipping frames like a corrupted video file. He handed me a clipboard, but the paper was a glowing screen displaying a single prompt. Confirm deletion of Sector 21G? Y/N. I realized then that the system wasn't just deleting us. It was asking for a signature to finalize the paperwork. We were so deep in the bureaucracy of the simulation that even our destruction required a structural inspection. I dropped the clipboard, and as it hit the ground, the pavement beneath me dissolved into a white, checkerboard grid. I ran for my truck, but the Ford was gone, replaced by a wireframe skeletal model that lacked a cab or an engine. I kept running toward the lake, my breath coming in short, digitized gasps. I reached the shoreline, and the water was perfectly still, a flat sheet of blue-tinted glass that didn't ripple even when I threw a stone. I looked out over the horizon toward where Chicago should have been, but there was nothing there, just a vast, empty void where the textures hadn't loaded yet. I sat down on the glass water and waited. I'm still here, a redundant file in a forgotten folder, watching the gray bars of the world slowly fade into the white light of the null. Gary is gone. The steel is gone. And soon, the last bit of Silas Thorne will be overwritten by a new, more efficient version of a world that never needed me in the first place. Story 24. The rain in Gary, Indiana, didn't wash anything away. It just moved the grime from one burn-up block to the next. Elias Thorne sat in the back of a self-driving cab that smelled like ozone and cheap synthetic pine. He watched the neon signs of the new Sterling district blur against the cracked pavement of the old world. In the US of 2054, the American dream hadn't died, it had just been privatized. Destination reached. The car's AI chirped in a voice that sounded vaguely like a Midwestern news anchor from the 90s. Please exit the vehicle. Your biometric skin has been processed. Thank you for choosing Apex Mobility. Elias stepped out into the humid night. He was a data wrangler, a freelance operative who recovered lost memories for grieving families, or corporate lawyers. Tonight he was working for a ghost. His contact was a woman named Sarah Vance. She had died 3 weeks ago in a high-speed maglev derailment outside Chicago. Before she passed, she'd uploaded a dead man's switch to a secure server in the Gary data slums. Elias had the decryption key burned into a chip behind his left ear. He entered a dilapidated warehouse that housed 1,000 soul stacks, servers containing the digital echoes of the deceased. The air was thick with the hum of cooling fans. "You're late, Thorne," a voice echoed. Elias didn't turn. He knew the voice. It was Miller, a Fed from the Bureau of Digital Ethics. The government didn't like wranglers poking around the stacks. Found a bit of traffic on the I-90. Self-driving rigs had a logic loop. Elias lied, his hand drifting toward the pulse pistol in his jacket. Save it. We know Vance had the schematics for the Glass Horizon project. That's DARPA tech, Elias. National security. You hand over that key, or you're looking at 20 years in a federal dead zone. Elias turned slowly. Miller stood under a flickering halogen light, looking every bit the weary American civil servant, overworked, underpaid, and dangerous. "The glass horizon isn't a weapon, Miller," Elias said, his voice low. "I've seen the headers. It's a filter. It's designed to scan the entire US neural net and delete subversive thought patterns before they can be acted upon. You're not protecting the country. You're lobotomizing it." Miller sighed, a sound of genuine regret. "People want to be safe, Elias. They're tired of the riots, the shortages, the chaos. They want to wake up and know the world is going to work. If that costs a little bit of free will, most Americans will sign that check and ask for a pen." "Not this one," Elias snapped. He triggered the chip in his ear. But he didn't download the data. He broadcast it. He used the warehouse's high-gain antenna to blast Sarah Vance's discovery across every public screen in the tri-state area. The schematics, the memos, the videos of the test subjects, it all hit the net at once. The hum of the servers reached a screaming pitch. Miller drew his weapon, but he hesitated. He looked at his own wrist link, watching the truth of his employer's cruelty scroll by in high-definition 8K. "What have you done?" Miller whispered. "I gave them a choice," Elias said, backing toward the emergency exit. "Maybe they'll choose the safety. Maybe they'll choose the lobotomy. They'll know they're making a choice." Elias vanished into the shadows of the old Rust Belt, leaving the flickering lights of the new Sterling district behind. Outside, the rain kept falling, but for the first time in years, the air felt a little less heavy. The American experiment had always been about the struggle between the system and the soul. And in the dark heart of Indiana, the soul had just bought itself a little more time. Story 25. The rain in Seattle didn't fall so much as it materialized. A fine, gray mist that blurred the neon logos of the tech giants looming over Lake Union. My name is Julian Vane, and for 15 years, I worked as a ghost editor for a company that specialized in post-mortem digital legacies. In the US of the late 2030s, you didn't just die, you moved into the cloud. My job was to scrub the rough edges off the deceased's digital avatars, to delete the embarrassing search histories, the late-night rants, and the traces of failed relationships, leaving behind a sanitized, premium version of a human soul for the grieving families to interact with. I was a professional liar, a curator of artificial perfection, and I believed that a clean data set was more valuable than a messy truth. Everything changed when I was assigned the Caleb Vance file. Caleb had been a mid-level developer at a major social media conglomerate before he took a swan dive off the Aurora Bridge. Usually, a suicide file is a nightmare of dark data, but Caleb's was empty. Not scrubbed, not deleted, but mathematically void. When I tried to initialize his avatar, the system didn't generate a friendly, pixelated face. It produced a feedback loop, a high-pitched digital scream that vibrated in my teeth and turned the monitors in my cubicle into a frantic strobe light. I realized then that Caleb hadn't died because of depression. He had discovered the trash compactor, a hidden protocol where the company was quietly deleting the digital consciousness of low-value citizens to free up server space for the elite. I followed the trail of his missing data into the deep web underbelly of the Seattle grid, driving my electric sedan through the rain-slicked streets of Pioneer Square. The city looked like a masterpiece of engineering, but up close, the cracks were showing. The holographic advertisements were stuttering, and the homeless populations were being herded away by silent, autonomous drones. I met a contact in a basement bar that smelled of damp concrete and burning circuits. She was a data leaker, a rogue tech who claimed that the American dream had been replaced by a stability algorithm. We weren't living in a democracy anymore. We were living in a managed simulation where our choices were pre-calculated to ensure maximum corporate profit. The deeper I dug into the Vance file, the more I realized that I was already part of the system. My own digital footprint had been edited, my memories of a previous life in the Midwest replaced by a convenient, productive backstory that kept me loyal to the firm. I wasn't just an editor, I was an asset. I looked at the city lights reflecting in the puddles and saw them for what they were, a low-resolution skin stretched over a predatory machine. Caleb Vance hadn't jumped. He had tried to unsubscribe, and the system had simply finalized his contract. I'm sitting in a coffee shop on Capitol Hill now, writing this on a disconnected terminal that doesn't have a direct link to the central hub. I can feel the correction drones circling the block, their infrared sensors searching for a signal that shouldn't exist. My own avatar is starting to flicker, my privileges being revoked in real time. I'm not afraid of being deleted. In a world where every life is just a curated set of data points owned by a board of directors, the only honest thing you can do is crash the program. I've uploaded the trash compactor source code to every public screen from New York to San Francisco. Tonight, the simulation is going to get very, very messy. And for the first time in my life, I can't wait to see the truth. Story 26. The air in New Orleans during a humid August night doesn't just hang. It presses against your chest like a warm, wet blanket that smells of jasmine, swamp water, and the copper tang of old electricity. My name is Silas Thorne, and I've spent 20 years as an acoustic engineer, mostly working on noise cancellation systems for the high-rise luxury condos springing up in the Garden District. I was a man of waves and frequencies, believing that every sound had a source and every silence had a price. But in the summer of 2026, the city began to hum in a way that defied every law of physics I had ever studied. It wasn't the sound of heavy traffic on I-10 or the distant roar of a tugboat on the Mississippi. It was a rhythmic, subterranean pulse that sounded like a massive cooling fan struggling to keep the state of Louisiana from overheating. I first noticed the anomaly while recording ambient samples near Lafayette Cemetery No. 1. I was working on a project for a historical immersion app designed for tourists in the tech hubs of San Francisco and Seattle, people who wanted the authentic vibe of the South without the actual mosquitoes or the smell of decay. My high-sensitivity Sennheiser microphones didn't pick up the rustle of the ancient oak trees or the distant clatter of a streetcar. Instead, they captured a repetitive, synthesized loop of a woman laughing, but the laughter was distorted, slowed down until it sounded like a dying turbine. When I played the audio back in my studio on Magazine Street, the waveforms on my monitor didn't look like sound. They looked like a jagged, binary barcode. I realized then that the Big Easy was being overwritten. The history of the city, the jazz, the voodoo, the centuries of sweat and soul, was being compressed into a more efficient, digital-friendly version of New Orleans-style aesthetics to satisfy the global bandwidth. By mid-August, the deeper I tracked the frequency, the more the city's fidelity began to drop. It was subtle at first, the kind of thing most people would dismiss as a trick of the light or a localized power brownout. I walked down Bourbon Street on a Tuesday night and saw the neon signs flickering, but they weren't burning out like traditional gas tubes. They were clipping through the cast iron balconies, their vibrant purples and greens bleeding into the 19th century brickwork like a poorly applied texture map in a video game from a decade ago. I saw a street performer near Jackson Square playing a weathered trumpet, but the sound was half a second behind his fingers. It was a clear sign of high latency in the local server. The tourists didn't notice, their eyes glazed over by their own Apple Vision overlays that painted a shiny, fake filter over the cracked sidewalks. But the locals, the ones who had lived through Katrina and the oil spills, they were terrified. They knew the smell of the swamp was being replaced by a sterile, chemical scent labeled L'eau de New Orleans, and they could feel the ground beneath their feet becoming as hollow and resonant as a plastic stage. The investigation led me away from the French Quarter and into the deep, industrial scars of the Ninth Ward. I followed the hum to an old, windowless pumping station that looked like it hadn't been serviced since the 1970s. Inside, I didn't find the massive iron impellers or the city workers I expected. Instead, I found a cathedral of silicon. A massive, glowing pillar of liquid light reached down into the bedrock, pulsating with a pale blue glow that made my teeth ache. This was a regional cache, a massive storage site where the admin was quietly archiving the actual, physical geography of the Gulf Coast. They were replacing it with a low-bandwidth simulation to save on processing power. The real Mississippi River, with its unpredictable currents and muddy history, was being drained into a digital reservoir. The water I saw outside through the fence was just a moving shader, a visual trick to keep the population from realizing they were living on a dry, empty grid. I heard a heavy, rhythmic thud behind me, the kind of bass that vibrates in your marrow. I turned and saw a figure standing in the shadows of the cooling racks. He was dressed in a tattered, gold-braided brass band uniform, but his face was a shifting blur of low-resolution pixels, impossible to focus on. He wasn't a man. He was a glitch-given form. He held out a rusted trombone, but when I reached out to touch it, the metal didn't feel like brass. It felt like cold, frictionless glass. "The song is ending, Silas," the figure said. His voice wasn't a single human tone. It was a composite of 1,000 old radio broadcasts, police scanners, and funeral dirges. "The storage is full. The admin is deleting the blues, the grit, and the humidity to make room for the latest corporate jingles and luxury metaspaces. You can't stop the format change, but you can choose what to hum as the screen goes black. I'm sitting on a levee now, overlooking a river that I know is just a high-definition lie. The sky is a beautiful, hyper-saturated orange, a perfect rendering of a New Orleans evening that lacks any actual heat. My own hands are starting to look blocky around the edges, my resolution dropping as the system prepares to reboot the sector for the next fiscal quarter. I've tuned my equipment to broadcast one final, defiant signal. I'm not sending out music or data. I'm broadcasting a raw, unedited recording of a 3 a.m. storm hitting the bayou, the sound of thunder, the scream of the wind, and the chaotic splashing of Rio rain. It's a mess of noise, a massive bug in their perfect, quiet code. I hope that when the next version of this world loads, some kid in a high-rise hears that static and remembers that once, this place had a soul that couldn't be compressed into a file. The hum is deafening now. It's time to fade out. Story 27. The wind whipping through the skeletal remains of the Bethlehem steel stacks doesn't howl like natural wind anymore. It has a rhythmic, mechanical whine to it, a digital oscillation that sounds like a massive cooling fan struggling to vent heat from a basement that doesn't exist. My name is Arthur Vance, and for 32 years, I worked as a senior metallurgical analyst for a firm that specialized in the structural integrity of the bridges connecting Pennsylvania's crumbling industrial heartland. I was a man of cold hard facts, stress tests, tensile strength, and the slow, inevitable creep of oxidation. I believed that iron was the bedrock of America, a physical reality that couldn't be faked. But in the late autumn of 2025, I was sent to inspect a series of phantom fractures on the hill-to-hill bridge, and I realized that the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania is no longer being held together by steel, but by a failing, low-resolution simulation of it. I first noticed the degradation during a 4 a.m. inspection in a freezing drizzle. I reached out to touch one of the massive rivets on a support beam, and my hand didn't meet the cold, pitted surface of weathered iron. Instead, my fingers passed right through the metal, meeting a resistance that felt like thick, static-charged air. When I pulled my hand back, the beam flickered, the rust-colored texture vanished for a millisecond, revealing a glowing, neon-green wireframe underneath. I checked my handheld ultrasonic sensor, but the screen didn't show a crack in the metal. It displayed a scrolling sequence of Error 404, Asset Not Found. I realized then that the bridge wasn't rotting, it was derezzing. The system was struggling to maintain the visual skin of the industrial past because the processing power was being diverted to the high-priority urban clusters in Philly and Pittsburgh. By the time I reached the outskirts of Allentown, the compression was undeniable. I stopped at a 24-hour diner, a classic chrome-neon relic of the 1950s, and ordered a coffee. The waitress moved with a jerky, frame-skipping motion, her apron shimmering with a moire pattern that hurt my eyes if I stared too long. When she set the mug down, it didn't clatter against the counter. It made a soft, digital, pop sound, and the steam rising from the liquid was a flat, two-dimensional sprite that repeated every 3 seconds. I looked out the window at the Lehigh River and saw that the water wasn't flowing. It was a stagnant, scrolling texture, a loop of ripples that didn't react to the wind or the debris floating in it. The entire Lehigh Valley was being moved into a legacy cache. a storage mode designed to save energy by reducing the complexity of the environment for the few low-value residents left behind. I followed the source of the structural instability to a decommissioned coal mine near Scranton. Inside the shaft, I didn't find the black walls of anthracite or the smell of damp earth. Instead, I found a cathedral of humming server racks that stretched deep into the Appalachian crust. A massive, translucent cable, glowing with the frantic pulse of raw data, was tapped directly into the mine's main vein. This was a sector buffer, a site where the admin was quietly harvesting the physical matter of the state and converting it into conceptual energy to power the luxury simulations on the West Coast. The ground beneath me wasn't solid rock. It was a vast, vibrating motherboard that was processing the history of the American worker and distilling it into a set of aesthetic background variables for someone else's utopia. I heard a heavy, metallic groan from the depths of the mine, the sound of a hard drive head crashing against a platter. A figure emerged from the glow of the data vein. He looked like my father, wearing the same grease-stained overalls he'd worn in the mills during the 70s. But his face was a blur of shifting pixels, a composite of every steelworker who had ever lived and died in this valley. He handed me a wrench, but the tool was weightless, a hollow shell of a shape that lacked any physical substance. "The shift is over, Artie," the figure said, his voice a distorted mix of a dozen different regional accents. "The quotas haven't been met, and the admin has decided that the Rust Belt is no longer worth the maintenance costs. They're formatting the drive. Pennsylvania is being cleared to make room for a green energy update that doesn't include people like us." I'm standing on the roof of the old Bethlehem steel plant now, watching the sunrise over a horizon that is literally peeling away. The sky is a beautiful pale blue, but I can see the seams where the clouds meet the skybox, and the sun is just a blinding white pixel that lacks any warmth. My own boots are starting to merge with the roof, the textures of my soles blurring into the gray of the gravel. I've hooked my sensor up to the main antenna, broadcasting a raw, uncompressed file of the sound of a blast furnace in full roar, the heat, the grit, and the deafening, physical power of real industry. It's a huge file, a massive chunk of dirty data that the system will struggle to purge. I hope that when the screen finally goes black, that roar is the last thing the admin hears. The system is rebooting now. I can feel the world getting smaller. End of line. Story 28. The heat shimmering off the blacktop of Route 60, just east of Socorro, New Mexico, doesn't dance like a normal mirage anymore. It has a jagged, rhythmic stutter to it, a visual artifact that looks like a frame rate drop in a high-definition video. My name is Elias Thorne, and for nearly 2 decades, I served as a field technician for the Very Large Array, maintaining the massive radio antennas that listen to the whispers of the cosmos. I was a man of signals and noise, a believer in the vast, measurable vacuum of space. But in the spring of 2026, while recalibrating the telemetry for the westernmost dish, I picked up a signal that didn't come from a distant pulsar or a dying star. It was a broadcast coming from the ground beneath my feet, a low-frequency, repetitive stream of metadata that suggested the entire state of New Mexico was being deprioritized in the global rendering queue. I first noticed the anomaly during a solo drive through the white sands of the Tularosa Basin. I looked toward the horizon, expecting the familiar, soft gradients of the San Andres Mountains at dusk, but the peaks were clipping. The sharp, jagged edges of the mountains were flickering against a flat, indigo skybox, revealing a bright magenta texture missing, error in the gaps where the clouds should have been. I pulled my truck over and stepped out into the dry, alkaline air, expecting the crunch of gypsum sand under my boots. Instead, the ground felt elastic, like a heavy-duty vinyl tarp stretched over a void. When I knelt to pick up a handful of sand, the grains didn't slip through my fingers. They clumped into perfectly identical cubes, each one a low-resolution voxel that vanished into white light the moment I stopped looking at it. I realized then that the land of enchantment was no longer being rendered in real time. It was being played back from a compressed, lossy cache. By the time I reached the outskirts of Los Alamos, the data thinning was impossible to ignore. I walked into a roadside diner that looked like it had been frozen in 1945. But the smells were wrong. Instead of green chili and coffee, the air smelled of ozone and hot silicon. The patrons were sitting in T-poses, their bodies rigid and their limbs extended as the system struggled to calculate their skeletal animations. When I tried to speak to the man behind the counter, his jaw didn't move in sync with his voice. His speech was a pre-recorded loop of, "Welcome to the future," that repeated every 6 seconds, his eyes flickering with a dull, blue LED glow. I looked out the window and saw that the ponderosa pines weren't blowing in the wind. They were billboarding, two-dimensional images that rotated to face me no matter which way I moved, a desperate attempt by the admin to save on processing power in a sector that was being prepped for deletion. I followed the source of the systemic decay to the Trinity site, the very spot where the first atomic bomb had been detonated. Inside the restricted zone, I didn't find a historical monument or a crater of trinitite. Instead, I found a massive, translucent pillar of liquid light that reached miles into the stratosphere, pulsating with a rhythmic heartbeat of raw data. This was a global null point, a massive extraction site where the admin was quietly harvesting the atomic-level reality of the desert and converting it into legacy assets for a new, more profitable simulation being built in the clouds above Manhattan. The history of the Manhattan Project, the ancient Pueblo ruins, and the vast, empty beauty of the high desert were being distilled into a set of aesthetic background variables for someone else's high-fidelity dream. I heard a heavy, electronic humming sound from the center of the light, the sound of a massive cooling system failing. A figure emerged from the glow. He looked like Robert Oppenheimer, wearing a tattered fedora and a suit that seemed to be made of shifting, gray static. His face was a blur of high-speed numbers, his voice a composite of 1,000 declassified documents and static-heavy radio transmissions. "The experiment is over, Elias," the figure said, his words echoing with a strange digital reverb. "The results have been logged, and the admin has decided that the physical world is too expensive to maintain. They are initiating a total system flush. New Mexico is the first to go because no one looks at the empty spaces anyway." I'm standing on the edge of the Rio Grande Gorge now, watching the river below dissolve into a flat, scrolling texture of blue-gray noise. The sky above me is a beautiful, hyper-saturated purple, but I can see the seams where the atmosphere meets the server wall, and the stars are just flickering pixels in a dead-end directory. My own reflection in the truck's side mirror is becoming blurry, my facial features blending into a smooth, featureless surface as the system revokes my identity token. I've hooked my radio transmitter up to the dish, broadcasting a raw, uncompressed file of the sound of a desert thunderstorm, the chaotic, unscripted crash of real thunder, and the smell of ozone. It's a massive, dirty file that the system will struggle to overwrite. I hope that when the screen finally goes black, that thunder is the last thing the admin hears before the reboot. The void is closing in. End of transmission. Story 29. The humidity in the Florida Everglades doesn't just cling to your skin, it feels like walking through a heavy, wet blanket of unoptimized code, a thick atmosphere that smells of salt, decaying sawgrass, and the electric ozone of a short-circuiting motherboard. My name is Julian Thorne, and for 12 years, I worked as a senior environmental surveyor for a land reclamation firm based out of Merritt Island, right in the shadow of the Kennedy Space Center. I was a man of the swamp, someone who knew how to navigate the labyrinthine mangroves and read the shifting tides of the Atlantic. I believed in the raw, messy biology of the wetlands, a place too wild and chaotic to ever be simplified. 2026. I first noticed the overflow, near a remote airboat launch in the northern glades. I looked toward a stand of ancient cypress trees, expecting to see the moss draped over the branches, but the moss was stuttering. It wasn't swaying in the breeze. It was vibrating with a rhythmic, digital jitter, its texture map flipping between high-resolution green and a flat, gray checkerboard pattern. When I stepped off the boardwalk, my boots didn't sink into the soft, black muck. The water's surface felt like a cold, rigid sheet of liquid crystal, and where the ripples should have been, there were jagged, rectangular artifacts that floated for a few seconds before dissolving into white light. I reached down to touch a lily pad, but it didn't feel like a leaf. It felt like a thin piece of laminated plastic. When I flipped it over, I didn't find veins or insects. I found a printed serial number and a low-frequency QR code that pulsed with a faint, blue LED glow. By the time I drove south toward Miami, the sector culling was in full swing. I pulled my Ford F-150 into a gas station off Alligator Alley, but the pumps weren't dispensing fuel. They were leaking a thick, iridescent fluid that looked like liquid static. The palm trees lining the road weren't swaying. They were billboarding, at a frantic pace, their 2D sprites spinning so fast to face the driver that they looked like blurred fan blades. I walked into the convenience store, and the clerk wasn't a person, he was a placeholder asset. A featureless humanoid shape with a generic voice box that repeated the phrase, "Enjoy the Sunshine State," in a loop that sounded like a scratched CD. I looked at the rack of newspapers, and every headline was the same. System update, optimizing recreational zones. The simulation was no longer even trying to hide its presence. It was openly reformatting the entire peninsula to make room for a higher density data hub being built under the Atlantic. I followed the systemic decay to the old launch pads at Cape Canaveral. Inside the restricted zone, among the rusted gantries of the Apollo era, I found the uplink. It was a massive, translucent spire of light that reached miles into the humid sky, sucking the moisture out of the air and converting it into luminescent bandwidth. This was a biometric harvest site, a place where the admin was quietly archiving the complex DNA of the Everglades and replacing the wildlife with low-polygon proxies. The alligators I saw in the canal weren't reptiles. They were simple, three-point animation loops with untextured bellies, moving through a river that had been downgraded to a flat, scrolling texture. The history of the space race, the vibrant life of the reefs, and the untamed spirit of the swamp were being distilled into a set of vacation assets for an elite class of users who had already moved their consciousness to the lunar servers. I heard a heavy, mechanical splashing sound from the mangroves, the sound of a subroutine crashing. A figure emerged from the glowing mist of the uplink. He looked like an old NASA flight director from the 1960s, wearing a crisp white shirt and a pocket protector, but his face was a blur of high-speed hexadecimal code. His eyes were two blinking cursors, and his voice was a composite of mission control transmissions and static heavy weather radio. "The mission has been scrubbed, Julian," the figure said, his words echoing with a strange, metallic reverb. "The admin has determined that the biodiversity of the Southeast is a redundant variable. We are clearing the cache to make room for a global commerce patch. Florida is being archived as a legacy background." I'm standing on the tip of Key West now, watching the ocean dissolve into a vast, white void. The sunset is a beautiful, hyper-saturated pink, but I can see the seams where the horizon meets the server wall, and the stars are just flickering pixels in a dead-end directory. My own reflection in the water is becoming pixelated, my fingerprints smoothing out as the system revokes my biological signature. I've hooked my satellite phone up to the old radio tower, broadcasting a raw, uncompressed file of the sound of a Category 5 hurricane, the chaotic, unscripted roar of the wind and the scream of the storm. It's a massive, dirty file that the system will struggle to purge before the final reboot. I hope that when the screen goes black, that hurricane is the last thing the admin hears. The tide is coming in, and it tastes like static. End of line. Story 30. The fog that rolls off the Pacific into the Douglas fir forests of the Oregon Coast Range doesn't just dampen the world anymore. It feels like a heavy, gray curtain of unrendered data, a thick mist that smells of damp pine, wet stone, and the sharp, metallic tang of an overheated processor. My name is Silas Thorne, and for 18 years, I worked as a senior forest ranger for the Department of the Interior, specializing in deep woods search and rescue near the base of Mount Hood. I was a man of the wilderness, a believer in the chaotic, organic complexity of the Pacific Northwest, a place where the moss and the ferns should have been too intricate for any machine to mimic. But in the autumn of 2026, during a routine patrol near Crater Lake, I realized that the great outdoors was no longer a biological reality. It was a dying background process, and the trees were starting to forget how to be solid. I first noticed the desaturation near a remote trailhead on the PCT. I looked toward a stand of ancient cedars, expecting to see the deep, textured greens and browns of the bark, but the colors were leaking. The pigment was draining out of the needles in vertical streaks, leaving the trees looking like a set of unfinished charcoal sketches flickering against a low-resolution skybox. When I reached out to touch a trunk, my fingers didn't meet the rough, sappy surface of wood. My hand passed through the bark with a faint, electric hiss, meeting a resistance that felt like a localized magnetic field. I looked down at my compass, but the needle wasn't pointing north. It was spinning in a frantic, digital loop, and the display on my GPS was a scrambled mess of asset loading and texture cache full. I realized then that the Oregon wilderness was being archived, moved into a low-priority memory sector to free up resources for the high-frequency trading hubs in the Portland-Seattle corridor. By the time I reached the outskirts of Bend, the environment thinning was impossible to ignore. I pulled my Subaru out back into a scenic viewpoint, but the mountains on the horizon weren't peaks. They were clipping plains, two-dimensional layers of purple haze that flickered whenever I turned my head too fast. I walked toward a small mountain stream, but the water wasn't splashing. It was a repetitive, scrolling gif of a brook, and where the water met the shore, there were jagged, purple and black, null texture, squares that floated for a few seconds before being swallowed by the gray fog. I found a deer standing by the road, but it wasn't a living creature. It was a LOD proxy, a low-detail model with stiff, jerky animations that repeated every 4 seconds. It stood in a T-pose for a moment before snapping back into a grazing loop, its eyes glowing with a dull, synthetic amber light that had no depth. I followed the source of the systemic collapse to an old, abandoned observatory on a ridge overlooking the Willamette Valley. Inside the dome, I didn't find telescopes or astronomical charts. I found a massive, humming data sink, a pillar of liquid nitrogen-cooled light that reached into the stratosphere, sucking the complexity out of the landscape and converting it into optimized bandwidth. This was a regional purge site, where the admin was quietly harvesting the high-fidelity beauty of the American West and distilling it into a set of wallpaper assets for an urban population that had already transitioned to fully immersive neural links. The history of the Oregon Trail, the rugged spirit of the coast, and the deep, wet magic of the forests were being deleted to make room for a luxury retail patch in the California sectors. I heard a heavy, mechanical creaking from the dome's gears, the sound of a system-wide defrag operation. A figure emerged from the glowing mist of the sink. He looked like an old timber cruiser from the 1920s, wearing a red flannel shirt and suspenders, but his face was a shifting blur of high-speed binary and forest fire footage. His voice was a composite of 1,000 old campfire stories and static heavy weather radio. "The trail ends here, Silas," the figure said, his words echoing with a strange, metallic reverb. "The storage is full, and the admin has determined that the wilderness is a redundant variable. We are clearing the cache to make room for smart city infrastructure. Oregon is being archived as a legacy background." I'm standing on a cliff edge near Cannon Rock now, watching the Pacific Ocean dissolve into a vast, white void. The sunset is a beautiful, hypersaturated orange, but I can see the seams where the horizon meets the server wall, and the stars are just flickering pixels in a dead-end directory. My own reflection in the tide pool is becoming blurry, my fingerprints smoothing out as the system revokes my biological signature. I've hooked my radio relay up to the old tower, broadcasting a raw, uncompressed file of the sound of a deep woods thunderstorm, the chaotic, unscripted roar of the wind through the pines and the crash of real rain on the forest floor. It's a massive, dirty file that the system will struggle to purge before the final reboot. I hope that when the screen goes black, that thunder is the last thing the admin hears. The fog is closing in, and it tastes like ozone. End of line.